JP Morgan suggests demand for the tech giant's new iPhones may be softening. A note to investors says lead times for the iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max are falling. Analysts track the number of days that it takes for customers to get the phones they order as a sign of demand strength. I'm Lisa Mateo. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Matt Miller and Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We have a treat right here. Our very own Steve Rappaport from Bloomberg Radio joins us in studio. Steve, talk to us about your experience with Israel. We were talking just off air. Most or all of your family lives in Israel, correct?
That's correct. All of my immediate family lives there, and I'm supposed to be there right now.
So you're supposed to fly over the weekend, but obviously things happen. All right, so did your family move back to Israel? Were they from Israel? How did that?
No, they all decided to move gradually. My sister first. She is a lover of Israel, always has been. So when she moved, it wasn't a matter of if. We all knew it was just a matter of when.
And what's the draw? Because just from somebody who doesn't know anything about Israel, it seems like a risky place to live relative to some other places. So what is the draw for maybe your family members?
The draw is, I would say, basically, there is only one country that is the Jewish state. It is a place where Jewish people over the years have felt safe despite unrest. And it is also a country where if you are Jewish, you can get citizenship. It's called the law of return. You can come back. You can become a citizen of the Holy Land, if you will.
I imagine
I imagine there's also a strong draw in terms of the weather, in terms of the food, in terms of the culture.
Absolutely.
I mean, you're right on the Mediterranean Sea. I imagine it must be an incredibly beautiful place to be.
Yes, it is a beautiful country, and the views, the mountains, the breathtaking, the Dead Sea, the ocean. It is a beautiful place,
So
despite some of the chaos that we've seen.
How does the average Israeli or your family members, how do they kind of put all that together that the constant, every single place you look, there are, I'm not sure if you want to call them enemies but people that don't necessarily wish you guys well, yet you're right there. How do you put all that together and balance it?
Well, for starters, a lot of people, I mean, basically you're living under a constant threat.
Yes.
So if you're born in Israel and raised, like my nieces and nephews, it's all you know.
Okay.
So it can be traumatizing, but when it's all you know, it can sort of become normal. And what we've seen in the past, by the way, Paul, is when there's violence, typically people, Israelis living far from the violence, just go about their day.
Right.
Not this time.
Yep.
This time it is different. My nephews and nieces are home. Schools are closed across the country. Not taking any chances.
And now we're seeing reports that this huge reserve call-up of more than 300,000, and we were speaking to our Israeli bureau chief from Bloomberg News earlier. I mean, it is just, as you say, everywhere. It's impacting everybody. What do you think the response, or from just speaking to your family members over there in Israel, what do they believe the response will be?
Well, the response is going to be one that's hard. And we've seen it. We saw the first incursion into Gaza, the ground incursion in 2009. There have been a total of, this will be the fourth war, but they're expecting a hard-hitting response. And we know that Netanyahu, there are reports that he discussed with President Biden a ground offensive saying that we have to go in. It's what his position is.
I also think it's interesting that they have a conscription army. So, as you're saying, Steve, if you're born there, you grow up with that, that's your normal state of being. But you also have a real responsibility to the society, to the country, to the state, you know, because everybody there, right, has to serve at least some time in the army and can be called back later.
Yes, there is one exception, an ultra-Orthodox sect known as the Haredim. They can get exemptions, but for just about everybody else, they have to serve. And Israel is very sensitive with regard to its citizens being sent into battle. For example, my brother-in-law is an only child, and the parents of an only child can request that their child is assigned a non-combat role, because if they only have that one child, the Israeli government is very sensitive about that. And I want to share with you something that happened over the weekend. My sister, brother-in-law, and the 4 children were walking to a bar mitzvah in Jerusalem. Sirens went off. They got on the ground. My sister and brother-in-law got on top of their kids.
Right.
This is what they do.
Yep. And unfortunately, it sounds like it's going to be going on for some period of time. Steve, thanks for coming in, joining in your personal story. Steve Rappaport, Bloomberg Radio kind of gives us all the stuff we need on the news, and he is living this day to day. His family is living it day to day in real time in Israel, and he was scheduled to go over there this weekend. Obviously, those flights and the plans were changed, so we appreciate getting a couple minutes from Steve. We'll have more coming up. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller.
We got a lot of green on the screen here, but the volume is light.
We constantly underestimate the strength of the U.S. consumer.
This is a market that's much more optimistic or bullish than maybe the central bankers are.
Breaking market news and insight from Bloomberg experts.
There's still some concern out there in the market that there is room for things to deteriorate a little bit more than what they're indicating.
As small and medium-sized businesses struggle, they don't present as much competition.
The supply chain has still got dislocations globally and here in the U.S.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, coming up in this hour, we're going to have more reporting on the Israeli conflict. We're going to get Sam Dauer, reporter on Saudi Arabia with Bloomberg News, joins us from Dubai. We'll get that angle of the story. Plus, Fernando Valle, he is the senior energy analyst with Bloomberg Intelligence. Get the latest on the global energy space, given what is going on in the Middle East, and we'll focus on Chevron in particular. And then Jennifer Lee, senior economist and managing director of BMO Capital Markets, will join us to discuss the Fed and what we can look for in terms of some of the inflation data we're going to get starting tomorrow in the remainder of the week. But first, let's kick this hour off like we do with Mr. John Tucker.
All right, start off with data just coming across the tape. New York Fed 1 year inflation expectation coming in at 3.67%. That was above the prior reading of 3.63. As for markets, sharply lowered Treasury yields in hopes the Fed may be finished raising interest rates. That has stocks rising today. PepsiCo, that's higher after the beverage and snack giant reported third quarter earnings. Looking forward, the banks, they're going to be opening their books later this week, Friday, as earnings season starts. Market strategist Tony Dwyer at Canaccord Genuity says this is not the time to buy those stocks just yet.
I don't think it's going to be great. Bank lending standards are tightening. NFIB just came out a little while ago. Small businesses aren't optimistic. The business side of it isn't great, but they've already been smoked. So what are you going to short them now? So I think it's just to kind of get out of the way, wait for credit to improve.
Citigroup, JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, BlackRock results quarterly season again. That kicks off on Friday. This week, inflation data, PPI. Tomorrow, Friday, we get the CPI. S&P 500 right now, 32 points higher. That's up 0.75%. We're at 43.67 on the index. The Dow up 152 points. The NASDAQ 100 up 134 points, a rise of 0.9%. 10-year yield 14 basis points lower at 465. We check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Matt and Paul.
All right, John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Matt Miller, Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. We're streaming live on YouTube as well, so you can check out youtube.com and search for Bloomberg Radio. Jess Menton joins us here in studio. Jess covers all the equity markets. Jess, what are you looking at right now?
I'm taking actually a close look what's happening in small cap stocks. So particularly when you're looking at the Russell 2000, so RTY up about 1.5% today. So we know that small caps have definitely underperformed their larger counterparts, but I was looking particularly if you're looking at what the IWM, so the ETF that tracks obviously the Russell 2000, and then the XLF, so that's the ETF that tracks the financials and the broader S&P 500. They've actually been tracking each other very closely if you overlay both of those charts over the past 5 years, and both of them were actually very close to retesting those pre-COVID highs in March of 2020, and typically over the past couple of years, they've actually served as some support levels, key levels there for buyers to come back and step in. So I wrote a piece for a Taking Stock column on our U.S. equity teams about this. So now you're starting to see both of those kind of bounce off a little bit there. Obviously, when you think of small cap stocks and obviously more domestically focused compared to when you're thinking about the multinational type companies, usually more than a third of those in the S&P 500, those have definitely been pummeled, not even just necessarily in recent months, but over the past almost 3 years. So when you look at the Russell 2000 and the ratio there compared to the S&P 500, the Russell 2000 is on pace for a third consecutive years of losses, and so that would be its biggest sort of streak there and the most pressured there since the late 1990s. But sort of the questions of whether or not most of the pain has potentially passed in small caps, because the reason the so what there is usually small caps tend to bottom before their larger counterparts. So that's something that my sources have been keeping a close eye on today.
Hang on, is this Taking Stock column out yet?
It is.
Okay. Banks face make or break, level at pre-crisis highs?
Correct.
Okay, excellent. Just wanted to make sure I get that. Came out at 7:21 this morning.
What's the
Usually I only look at the weekend stories for Jess.
You know what? I don't only write stories that run on the weekend, Matt Miller. I also have columns that come out during the week. We have an earnings watch where a lot of the reporters on our team will rotate. So I have one tomorrow that I'm going to be looking at. I can talk to y'all about.
By the way, do you expect margin compression now that inflation is coming down rather than going up?
So we talked to Gina Martin Adams about this yesterday, actually, over at Bloomberg Intelligence, who leads the equity coverage there. And so that's sort of the main question, because if you look at the earnings momentum revision, so that's 12 months out, so what Wall Street analysts are expecting, and they actually started marking up energy stocks. So that particular sector in recent weeks, just because of what we've seen, not surprisingly, with that big rise in oil prices. If you look at WTI, now down a little bit below $86 a barrel, but still a big move in recent weeks. But that's sort of the question, because they haven't been marking down their expectations broadly yet for particular sectors. So energy kind of leading the way on those revisions. Also, technology has continued to lead those revisions higher, as well as discretionary and industrials. So from her perspective, when you're looking at that, you haven't seen strategists change course just yet, but this is the beginning of earnings season, and typically you tend to see analysts mark those down heading into earnings season, and they haven't actually seen that happen yet. But to her point, it was really key on what could potentially change the dynamic and whether or not you see sort of renewed inflation pressures come in and what that could mean for potentially not necessarily some of these other sectors that I mentioned, but more of the consumer ones. We've talked a lot about, obviously, the retailers that are housed either in staples or discretionary. So that is what her and her team are keeping a close eye on. So they aren't seeing that just yet, but that doesn't mean that that won't necessarily happen. But based on Wall Street analysts, sort of the consensus forecast, they're thinking that the earnings recession would end in the current fourth quarter. So if you look at the estimates for the third quarter, it's expected to be a contraction of a little over 1%. But if you take energy out of that equation, the S&P 500 would actually be positive for that quarter.
It's going to be interesting to see how much earnings risk is still in this market, because if you look at the S&P 500 earnings, analysts are still looking for some growth this year, and then double-digit growth potentially next year. So I don't know. We'll have to see how it comes out, but it feels like there might be risk to that number.
It'll be interesting because Bloomberg Intelligence also will compile data. So we'll have to wait over the next few weeks, and especially once we get past the tech and growth companies that are reporting. Obviously, we have Tesla next week, but they do have metrics where they're able to see how companies are sort of reporting in excess of the S&P 500 and whether it's sort of outpacing what the S&P 500's gains or losses are that day. But that's stuff that we'll have over the next couple of weeks once we get some of those big names out. And then you'll probably be able to see whether or not it's more of an earnings-driven market or whether or not it's more of kind of a macro-driven.
All right, very good. Jess Menton, thank you so much for joining us. Jess Menton, she covers the markets for Bloomberg News, and we appreciate getting her thoughts.
Today's all macro.
It's all macro.
Right? Today, the idea, well, no, it's not even geopolitics. It's just the idea that the Fed had a couple of speakers singing from the same hymnal yesterday, and that hymnal said, we're not going to raise rates anymore.
Yep, and that's what the market likes, right? So we got the S&P up 0.9%.
Third day in a row of gains for the S&P.
You're keeping count.
Well, in case you'd forgotten over the weekend.
Yeah.
We were up on Friday.
Exactly.
We were up yesterday at the end of the day, and we're up today.
Okay, very good. Let's get back to the geopolitics, Israel, what it means for the region, the greater Middle East region. We want to go to Sam Dagger. He's a reporter covering Saudi Arabia for Bloomberg News. He is located in Dubai right now. Sam, can you talk to us about we're just a few days into what's been developing in Israel. Give us your sense of what you're hearing, what your sources are telling you about some of the ramifications for the greater Middle East region.
Absolutely. Great to be with you. I mean, obviously, the one thing in terms of ramifications that everybody's talking about is what does this do to efforts, U.S.-led efforts, to get Saudi Arabia and Israel to normalize their relations. I mean, obviously, the U.S. has put a lot of effort into this. The Biden administration had come out openly and said it was optimistic, and there were certain things that they needed to work out with the Saudis and with the Israelis as well, and things were progressing. And we had the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman just 3 weeks ago saying that progress was being made every day, and that we were getting closer to a deal. And then this that kind of puts the freeze on everything at the time being.
Sam, we, especially being in New York, I think here, for the most part, one side of this story. So many people here obviously have very close connections to Israel, have family members that live in Israel. And of course, the atrocities committed by the terrorists over the weekend aren't a great way for them to tell their story. But there are two sides to this thing, right? So being there, do you hear a lot from the Palestinian side?
Well, I'm in Dubai. I'm mainly hearing from people in the region. I mean, Saudis, Emiratis, people in the Gulf, who are coming out. I mean, I'm not saying all of them, but there are people in this region, including many Saudis, who are coming out in support of Hamas and saying, this is long overdue. I mean, I'm just quoting them now, saying this is in response to all of the atrocities. Again, this is them speaking, that Israel has been committing against them, and that this is in response to all of that, all the injustices. Again, I'm just quoting them, that the Palestinians have been subjected to. And so you have people in this part of the world who are looking at it differently.
Sam, what role do you think Saudi Arabia would like to play in this, or if any, or do you think they prefer to just kind of stay on the sidelines here?
No, I mean, definitely, I think they want to play a role in terms of just ending this. And they came out today and said this, and they said, I mean, the Crown Prince spoke, Mohammed bin Salman spoke today with the President of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas. He spoke to the Jordanian king and the Egyptian president, and then his foreign minister spoke to his counterpart in the U.S., Antony Blinken. So they're quite active, and they're saying this must not spread beyond Gaza.
And the problem is, we're hearing reports that missiles are being lobbed out of Lebanon. Obviously, the West Bank could be a real problem area, although for now it seems, at least from the reports I've read, that most of the threats are coming out of Gaza. How do you think things may change once Israel sends its troops into the Gaza Strip?
They will change a great deal. I mean, obviously, it depends on the scale of the Israeli operation, and once we unfortunately start to see the carnage that may be associated with this type of operation. I mean, again, depending on the scale of the operation, then obviously things are going to change. There are concerns also. I mean, you named Lebanon, West Bank, other places, Syria. I mean, we haven't reported this ourselves, but we've seen reports of Iranian proxies moving from certain parts of Syria closer to the border with Israel.
Are Jordan and Egyptian, are there no threats from those two neighbors?
In terms of direct threats to Israel?
Yes.
I mean, not that we know of, but in terms of the sentiment on the street, obviously most people in those countries are with the Palestinians.
Yeah, I'm just trying to round up the region. You look at the map and you see it's such a tightly knit area. And, I wonder if all the work that's been done to get the Saudis on, on the same page as the Israelis, it will be undone if there's a massive attack. I mean, if there's a massive response here, Sam, does it look like any kind of reconciliation with Saudi Arabia is off the table then?
I don't think we should jump to that conclusion right away. I mean, as my story today points out, I mean, obviously this is a blow to the Saudi vision for the region. I mean, the Saudi vision. I mean, it's not only they don't just have a vision for Saudi Arabia, the Vision 2030. They have a vision for the entire region, which says, shared economic benefits and prosperity. It should take precedence over wars and ideological differences. I mean, things that this part of the world has been mired in for decades. That's their vision, and they're saying we want to work with everyone. And you saw the concrete steps that they've taken since the beginning of the year. They've reached a détente with Iran that was brokered by the Chinese. They are negotiating directly with the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen. This is a country where they've been involved in war for 8 years. They've made overtures to Bashar al-Assad, who was backed by the Iranians. So they're doing everything to tamp down tensions. That's their vision. Their vision is development, prosperity. Juxtapose the Iranian vision, which is armed resistance, quote unquote, the annihilation of Israel, which is what the supreme leader said. I mean, that's the vision of Iran. So you've got two competing visions. Obviously, the Saudi vision has been dealt a blow, but I wouldn't be jumping to conclusions right away and say it's completely off the table.
Yes, Tim, you raised the issue of Iran, and that's clearly, for a lot of observers, one of the big wild cards here. What role do you think Saudi Arabia and maybe some of the Gulf neighbors there can have as it relates to, I guess, just mediating with Iran or just dealing with Iran or communicating with Iran. How do you see that playing out?
I mean, potentially, but I mean, the one country that has the most contact with the Iranians at the moment is Qatar. I mean, it mediated the U.S. hostage release, if you remember. So they're the countries in the best position to be involved anyway. And obviously, I mean, the Emiratis and the Saudis of late have, contacts now with the Iranians. Maybe they'll play a role too, but it's too early to see if that's going to happen.
All right, thanks very much. Really appreciate getting your thoughts there. Sam Dagger, he's a reporter in Dubai, talking with us about the greater, I think, Middle Eastern Gulf issue as this unfolds in Israel, because it seems like it's not going to be localized. It has a lot of
well, I mean, this is where
ramifications.
I think our reach is really key. You know, as Bloomberg, we have offices in something like 150 countries. John Tucker probably knows better than I do, but huge reach. And obviously, you're going to get one perspective here in New York that would be very different from the kind of perspectives a reporter like Sam gets in Dubai.
Yeah, exactly. And Saudi Arabia, obviously a big player in that part of the world. And as Sam was reporting, and as his reporting today showed that, Saudi Arabia really wants to be a major player in the overall region there in that part of the world. And a lot of that, as Sam's reporting showed, depends upon some just common prosperity, some a lack of tensions and bringing the tensions down. And obviously the weekend's events kind of throw that at least temporarily to the side here. Looking at these markets, the markets are trading higher. S&P 500 up 1% right here, 43 points. NASDAQ up 1.1%, so solid performance across the board. Yields coming in, 10-year treasuries down about 16 basis points, 4.64%. Also looking at on the crude oil space, off 1%, $85.50 for WTI crude oil. We're going to have more coming up. This is Bloomberg. Good morning. Let's get some company news right now with Lisa Mateo.
Thanks, Paul. Rivian is getting an upgrade from UBS from neutral to buy after plans were announced to issue $1.5 billion in convertible debt. Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow says the response has been mixed.
UBS kind of positive on this, saying that A, it removes the question over the need to raise capital, and they now think that Rivian will not need to raise capital through at least 2025. Mixed because you think back to yesterday, Wedbush had a very different view, cutting its price target on Rivian and basically labeling the convertible as a misstep. Last Thursday, the session after they'd announced the convertible, the stock fell 23%, the biggest drop on record.
Shares right now up more than 4.5%. Shares of Truist, they're higher after a report from Semaphore that the company is in talks to sell the rest of its insurance brokerage to private equity firm Stone Point Capital for about $10 billion. More from Bloomberg's Katie Greifeld.
Stone Point led the investor group earlier this year that bought about 20% of the insurance business for about $1.95 billion. Now it appears that Stone Point is coming for the remainder. Though, according to Semaphore reporting, it's important to note that talks have yet to reach a conclusion and may depend in part on Stone Point's ability to obtain financing.
Truist right now is up more than 1%. And Walt Disney CEO Bob Iger seems to be having some success with his strategy of focusing on streaming revenues instead of just subscriber growth. According to Bloomberg Research, Disney Plus had sales and average transaction values that have grown since a price increase last December. Analysts predict their revenue growth could outpace Netflix. Disney shares right now up a fraction. I'm Lisa Mateo, and this is Bloomberg. From the steps of the Supreme Court to the halls of Capitol Hill, get the latest news and analysis of the legal issues shaping our time. Download our daily Bloomberg Law podcast, available right now on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
On the latest edition of the Tape Podcast, a conversation with Ethan Bronner with Bloomberg News.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. Nearing the highs of the day for equity, stocks rallying as Treasury yields, they are tumbling today. Investors pretty much latched on to some of the Fed speak that suggests the central bank may be done raising interest rates. The S&P 500 hovering near the 4,400 level. Some analysts are citing a rebound from oversold levels. All 11 of the major industry groups in the S&P 500 right now are higher. Consumer discretionary, that is the best performer. The index up 42 points, up 1% at 4377. Dow Jones Industrial Average up 233 points, and the NASDAQ 100 right now 165 points higher. That is up 1.1%. Among some of the leaders right now, most active, Tesla shares up 3.3%. Advanced Micro Devices, that's up 1.4%. And Bank of America shares, they are up 3.6%. Remember, at the end of the week on Friday, the third quarter earnings reporting season begins with the banks. And the 10-year yield, the benchmark, 15 basis points lower. That is a big drop, 464 right now. We check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Matt and Paul.
All right, John Tucker, thank you so much. Matt Miller, Paul Sweeney, live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. One of the big moves yesterday in response to the news coming out of Israel over the weekend is crude oil. We had WTI crude oil, Brent crude oil up about 4 to 5% yesterday. Both of those are pulling back about 1% today, so a little bit of more stability coming into that market. But we want to get a sense of kind of what the war in Israel means for the global energy space. And for that, we turn to Fernando Valle. He is the senior analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence covering global energy. So, Fernando, let's start with Chevron. Talk to us about what's happening there, because I know they have a field in Israel that I believe the Israeli government has asked them or ordered them to shut down. So let's talk first about Chevron.
Yeah, absolutely. They have the Tamar and the Leviathan fields. They're natural gas fields offshore in Israel that produce around 55 to 60,000 barrels of oil equivalent a day of natural gas that's then shipped to Israel and sometimes liquefied and shipped out elsewhere. So it's a small percentage of their current production. They intend to grow in the region, but obviously this disruption may cause some slows down and some second thoughts around there. But it's not a significant short-term impact for the company itself.
But I know, I guess just for Europeans, they were getting some of, they were obviously lost the supply from Russia last winter. They're getting some of it was coming out of Israel. So is that a concern for European buyers?
Well, not just Israel, but then the broader scope of it, because they get a lot from Qatar, and Qatar shares its gas field, the North Field, the largest in the world, with Iran. So that is a significant concern if there is an escalation and if Iran is involved in how we get liquefied natural gas from Qatar over to Western Europe.
What's up with that giant natural gas field in Holland that they've decided not to use? Are they still using that?
Groningen is going to be shuttered this year. So no, because of the earthquakes and other and global warming concerns in Holland, they are decommissioning that field. It has been underproducing. They had extended the life for a little bit, but they will decommission Groningen.
All right, so Fernando, I think the expectation is that this conflict in Israel is going to intensify, maybe expand in scope a little bit. Give us a sense of kind of what the global oil markets are telling you over the last couple of days.
Well, the bounce back yesterday is really around reinforcing the Iran sanctions and the likelihood of a deal with the U.S. being off the table after the attacks. I'll caveat that Iran has been able to export a lot of its crude through the shadow tanker market. The official numbers show a huge decrease, but we know that some of those volumes had made its way to countries that don't observe the sanctions as tightly. This obviously lowers their overall revenues for the country, because as you limit the amount of buyers, it becomes more difficult for them to get a full price for their barrels. especially because China, the largest oil importer in the world, has said they're done issuing import quotas in 2023. So that creates a significant logjam in those countries, especially after Saudi Arabia had just raised prices to Asia.
So, all right. So when we see oil coming back up to $85 a barrel from, it had dropped to 82, but not nearly reaching the $95 a barrel last week, doesn't that signify that people just aren't very worried right now?
Well, I think it signifies that people are very worried about demand and not so much about supply.
Got it.
And that is really has been what Mike McGlone and I have harped on for the remainder of the year and early 2024, is that demand is really going to be in the driver's seat. And all the OPEC plus cuts, they just create spare capacity that could come in to satisfy supply in relatively short order. What this does is that it does create a benefit for U.S. suppliers because there are fewer barrels that are allowed in Western Europe and countries that abide by sanctions. So the Brent WTI spread we expect will continue to be very tight, but the overall price of oil we think will be governed by demand.
What is the expectations this winter for Europe? Will they have enough gas? Will they have enough fuel? Last winter came in much better than expected from that issue.
Yeah, I mean, that's the million-dollar question, and probably even more millions than that. They are at their highest natural gas inventories for seasonally adjusted. They're nearly full. And where there is an issue is, as Matt pointed, Groningen's offline. Belgium and Germany decommissioned their nuclear plants. So their overall use of natural gas is likely to increase. The question is, last year we had the warmest winter in 50 years on the Northern Hemisphere. If that's the case, then they're probably fine. If they're not, then that inventory will fall very quickly. It's not a whole season inventory. It's a buffer. And the other issue is that the diesel side of the equation, we're considerably short, both in Western Europe and in the Eastern United States and North America. So if we have an inclement winter, or even a normal winter, it would really put pressure on those inventories. And then you add the wrinkle of the Strait of Hormuz, the one shipping lane for Qatari natural gas. If that's shuttered, then it's a really big wrinkle.
How far out do people in your industry try and forecast the weather? I'm just interested because you mentioned last winter was unseasonably warm, and that's true. Can you look at this winter already and tell what it's going to be like with any kind of certainty?
Well, we try to forecast 5 years out, and we are successful about 2 weeks out, maybe sometimes less than that. It's very hard to forecast weather. I mean, I'm not a meteorologist, but it's clearly very hard, as you can tell from your weather app on your phone.
Fernando, what's the call in the energy space these days about China, both as a source of supply and more importantly, demand?
Well, as a source of supply, they've been on the decline since 2015, 2016, because their fields are relatively high cost to continue production. So they haven't really invested in growing the supply to the level required to recover the post-2015 levels. On the demand side, again, our fear has been around the real estate environment, and even the stimuli that's been promised by Beijing, the Chinese consumer is in a fairly dire spot. If we look at the average wage necessary to buy an apartment in Beijing or Shanghai, it dwarfs New York and London, which are, as we know, unaffordable. And so much of the provincial governments, obviously the real estate market, and then the provincial banks relied on land sales and development for their revenues. And with that drying up, it creates a huge headwind for the country as a whole. Everyone looks at China as having a fairly low debt to GDP ratio, but that's without accounting for all the provincial governments, all the provincial banks that ultimately rely on those governments. So once you consolidate that, their level of debt is fairly elevated, and they'll need to rectify that in order to return to the growth. And I'll mention that Exxon gave their guidance for the third quarter, and petrochemicals, very linked to construction, were down massively. I mean, they were less than half of the second quarter results.
All right, Fernando, thanks so much for joining us. As always, appreciate getting your global view on the energy space. Fernando Valle, Senior Analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence. And Matt, just staying on the global energy play, I did fill up the X3 yesterday for the first time, 89 octane.
89 octane?
So
are you allowed to do that?
I didn't go to the lowest. I went to the middle one.
But when you open
it says
the
91,
gas cap,
but it says minimum 89. So I went to the middle.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It says suggested 91, minimum
and Paul
89.
just does the minimum.
I just do the minimum.
Yeah, I mean, you buy your new car. Don't you want to exceed the minimum?
It's leased. So it's a rental.
I see.
It's the rental
If
mentality.
it's leased, I get it.
Yeah.
So what?
But you don't want someone who just does the minimum.
Lower octane.
Like in terms of pieces of flair, what are you typically wearing?
Is your engine going to blow up if you use lower octane?
No.
Okay. What's the big deal?
I don't think it'll perform as well. I'd be worried about knock a little bit, and it won't last as long.
Again, 3-year lease, not my
But
problem.
he doesn't care. Exactly.
Exactly right. S&P 500 up 1%. That's what I'm focused on today. The Fed kind of talking down some rate increases, potentially. That's what the market's discounting here. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. Amy Morris has got world and national news for us.
All right, thank you, guys. The conflict between Israel and the militant group Hamas is in its fourth day. The death toll near 1,600. Overnight, Israel hit the Gaza Strip and is now building a base to accommodate thousands of soldiers, getting ready for the next phase of its retaliation, which is raising questions about whether Israel is getting ready for a ground assault against Hamas. We get more on this now from Bloomberg's Israel Bureau Chief Ethan Bronner.
It's a very tense time. The military has told Israelis that they should have 72 hours worth of food and drink in their homes, preparing obviously for some kind of a counterattack, possibly from Hamas, but also possibly from the north, from Hezbollah.
Bloomberg's Ethan Bronner in Tel Aviv. President Biden will address the nation this afternoon on that war. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby previews the president's statement.
Our sympathies, obviously, with the loss and the suffering and the shock that they're going through, but also our firm resolve to make sure that they can continue to defend themselves against these terrorist attacks and to take action against Hamas directly.
The president is scheduled to give his address at 1 p.m. Eastern Time today. Former New York Representative Tom Suozzi announced today that he is running for Congress next year. Bloomberg's Michael Barr has that story.
The Long Island Democrat wants the seat currently held by embattled GOP Representative George Santos. On social media, Suozzi says the madness in Washington, D.C. and the absurdity of George Santos remaining in the United States Congress is obvious to everyone. Santos has been fighting criminal fraud and money laundering charges. Suozzi recently gave up the congressional seat in a failed run for governor. In New York, Michael Barr, Bloomberg Radio.
Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
News, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. If Treasury yields diving, as a result, stocks are rallying. Tesla, Nvidia, Amazon, Meta Platforms among the leaders in the S&P 500 right now. Fed speakers, they're suggesting the central bank rate hikes may be over. Now, for some confirmation, investors will be looking to the data, specifically the inflation data this week. We're going to get a reading on producer prices tomorrow, and then the consumer price index that's out Thursday. Economist Lindsay Piazza asked Stifel Nicholas a little worried about the impact of energy prices.
Well, we certainly have seen ongoing disinflationary improvement in the core, but what is concerning is that recent reversal in the headline. Now, of course, the Fed is not going to adjust policy based on a temporary move in headline prices. But the concern is that we've seen now higher energy prices driving headline prices for quite some time.
Amazon's fall sale for Prime subscribers that kicked off today. That's one of the most active stocks right now, up 0.4%. And then higher prices helping Pepsi increase its forecast for the fourth quarter. Sales during the third quarter grew 7%. Earnings per share, they grew 14%. We check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Matt and Paul.
Yes, sir. John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate that. As always, Matt Miller, Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. John was just saying, Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta President Raphael Bostic reiterated that he doesn't think policymakers need to raise interest rates any further, and the policy is restrictive enough to bring inflation back to their 2% goal. Let's see what the pros...
he's been saying that, but there are 12 members of the Federal Reserve Board who disagree with him.
That's right. Let's see what our next guest thinks about that. Jennifer Lee, Senior Economist and Managing Director at BMO Capital Markets. Jennifer, we're going to get a lot of more data this week on the inflation front, PPI tomorrow, and then CPI the day after. What do you think we're going to see in that data, and how do you think the Federal Reserve is viewing its fight against inflation?
Good morning. Thanks for having me on. So we're looking for, after August was, we saw a big jump in both the producer prices and as well as for consumer prices because of energy. So we're looking for a slower rate of growth for both the headline and the core of 0.3% for CPI, 0.2% for the PPI. I think overall, as long as it comes in within, a whisper, I guess, of expectations, the Fed should be fairly comfortable with that. But I think right now the new twist, and sometimes I feel a little bit weird just talking about the data, just given everything that's going on across on the other side of the world now. So I think right now it's the Fed is going to be more cautious in what it says. I thought it was interesting what you were just saying about Fed Speaker Bostic, because even over the weekend, when everyone was talking about how now a vice chair was saying that they're basically going to be on hold. One of the more hawkish Fed members from Dallas also said that basically the financial markets are doing the job for them. Not their words exactly, but that's basically what they're implying. So it seems that they are going to be more firmly rooted, I think, on the sidelines, especially given all this violence that's happening over in Israel right now.
Well, I feel like they had the same kind of plan as Mike Tyson, right? As soon as you get punched in the face, it changes. And if we get a PPI number that's high tomorrow or a CPI number that's high the next day, this Fed's data dependent, right? So what's the most important data to be watching?
I think for this week, it's definitely going to be on the CPI front for the core measure. And as we know, it's not even as much simple as just core anymore. They're looking at all the different components, like the goods side and the services side. And if they start seeing an increase there as well, I think they'll be a little bit more alert. But again, they have to be more cautious because this is one time when there is so much conflict, if it's not just in Russia and Ukraine, but now in Israel. And of course, some of the domestic issues right now playing out in the U.S. House, all the strikes that are going on. There's just so many balls in the air that I think they're going to be more cautious in terms of not wanting to rock the boat too much.
So, Jennifer, given kind of what we see out there in the inflation, it's moderating. Hopefully, we'll get more confirmation of that this week. What is the BMO call on just the economy? Is this economy that can land softly, or is a recession still in the cards?
So we have been on the soft landing, I'm using my air quotes here, soft landing side of the equation for some time. And of course, what's happening recently is making us a little bit more, not as comfortable, I guess, as we once were, but we're still looking for a mild, I guess, a nice soft-ish landing. Jobs report last week, like that blew everyone away. You know, my first reaction was, oh, come on, we're still being beat by these, we're still being surprised on the upside for these jobs numbers, just again, showing how resilient, and hopefully it's not sounding too boring anymore, but that resilient word is still being used and being used to apply to describe the U.S. economy. So I think that is still shaping up to help that soft landing story. Of course, with wages slowing a bit, that's it wasn't that bad actually, and it's actually a good thing that wage growth slowed. It's still enough to support U.S. consumer spending, but not enough. It wasn't going to fan any flames around the Fed.
Hey, we just saw some strikes in Canada now. GM workers striking there because they can't get the same deal as Ford. Of course, we have strikes here in the U.S. that continue to go on. How do you expect that to affect the economy? Whether it results in, I guess, supply issues driving up car prices or wage issues when they finally get a 30% raise.
I want to say a little bit of both. Now, with strikes, again, depending on how long they last for, we will see some sort of a bounce back when things resume. But of course, if it stretches on for a long period of time, it's certainly going to hurt the economy. Already, we're starting to see potentially like some suppliers, for example, not just directly within the auto producers themselves, but suppliers to that industry are starting to pull back, or potentially could start pulling back as well, depending again on how long this strike lasts for. So while we could see a downturn, we probably will. And it's going to be, as you pointed out, upward pressures on wages, which is not a good thing. This also has the potential to throw another curveball into this whole soft landing scenario. At the same time, it's got to be, both sides have to agree, right? So it can't be too outrageous, I don't think. So, but overall, you're seeing more of these strike actions take place, and of course, we saw the one of the writers' strike that ended earlier this weekend, which is good news. But then you see other things playing out. Like I think Walgreens pharmacists, for example, were already striking as well for are walking out on management apparently in several parts of the country. So just a lot of more worker unhappiness, I guess, being shown to management.
Jennifer, what's kind of your view on China? It seems like the reopening has underwhelmed, I guess is probably the fair way to say it. And so there's some concern there across markets, including energy markets, the strength or lack thereof of China's economy. How do you view that?
So the first quarter rebound, which seems way back when, was actually very strong. But of course, that fizzled very quickly. Things went downhill fairly quickly, and now. But it seems to be, and again, I've only seen some of the August data and a little bit of their September data. Things seem to have stabilized a little bit, and the fact that they're cutting rates, they're easing reserve requirements. Perhaps introducing some more fiscal stimulus will help stabilize, but I don't think we're going to see a huge rebound in the fourth quarter.
So next up for you, I guess the question for a lot of folks is just where does inflation go? Do you think that 2% number that the Fed talks about is realistic?
It seems so far away right now, of course, but we have for the U.S., for example, we see the U.S. getting a handle, at least something on that with a 2 handle on it by the end of next year. So I think it is realistic because they've been tightening so quickly and so often, or 500 basis points so far. Things are slowing, just not slowing as much as we had that anyone would have expected, I think. But if they continue to speak aggressively or hawkishly, which I think they're going to tone it down a little bit, I think it is possible, but it's just a little bit further out in the distance than, and it's not to be sooner rather than later.
Okay, Jennifer Lee, thank you so much for joining us. Jennifer Lee is a senior economist and managing director at BMO Capital Markets. That is Bank of Montreal. Looking at the markets here, S&P 500, we are holding on to the gains from earlier today. S&P is up by a solid 1%. The Dow's up about 0.7%, 229 points, breaking through that 34,000 barrier, 34,029.
And the rates have come in pretty aggressively today. The 10-year is down 17 basis points. as investors buy those bonds. 463 is the level on the 10-year. It's still over 5 on the 20-year. 5.017 is the yield you get on the 20-year bond, and the 30 is 4.826. So they're still elevated, but they're coming down 17, 15, and 14 basis points respectively.
The bank rate 30-year mortgage, 7.95%. So not seen in the mortgage market. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news right now with Lisa Mateo.
Thanks there, Paul. Just days after 23andMe confirmed user data was stolen and posted online for sale, a lawsuit has been filed against the company. Bloomberg's Steve Potisk has details.
The proposed class action claims 23andMe failed to protect the genetic information of thousands of people by maintaining it in a reckless manner. Information exposed in the breach included names, sex, date of birth, and genetic ancestry results. The complaint says it leaves victims open to identity theft. 23andMe did not respond immediately to a Bloomberg Law request for comment.
Shares right now, they are up about 8%. The coverage of the Israel-Hamas conflict on social media has Elon Musk's X being flooded with misinformation. Bloomberg's Jeff Bellinger has the story.
Lisa, many of the posts repurposed old images of armed violence and were pushed by anonymous accounts that carried blue check marks under X's paid subscription service. Others included military footage from video games. An X-Corp account stated the company is responding, but it is also in the public's interest to understand what's happening in real time, and users should change their settings to control what they see.
Now, experts say policy changes made by Musk have turned the platform into an unreliable resource in a time of crisis. And airlines, they're not the only ones being affected by the Israel-Hamas war. Cruise lines are also adjusting their routes. Norwegian Cruise Line, Princess Cruises, Holland America Line, and others, they have already notified guests of itinerary changes for sailings in the region. Norwegian Cruise right now up about 0.5%. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Lisa Mateo, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Matt Miller and Paul Sweeney live here in the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio in New York City to our worldwide audience. Strong moves in the equity markets today. The S&P up 1%, the NASDAQ up about 1.25%. And as Matt was just mentioning here, yields coming in sharply today. The 10-year Treasury, that bond is up 1 in 30 seconds, bringing the yield down about 17.5 basis points. 4 spots, 6.2 on your 10-year. The 2 years, 4.93. WTI crude oil, it pulls back about 0.8% after that 4.5% move higher yesterday. A barrel of WTI crude oil is about $85.70 here. So we're keeping an eye on that as the events in Israel continue to unfold. With our news down in Washington, D.C., let's head to Amy Mars.
All right, thank you, Paul. The conflict between Israel and the militant group Hamas has entered a 4th day. We spoke with the country's Minister of Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer.
Israel will always remember that day, but all the terror organizations around us are going to remember this period for a very long time, and they have awoken not a sleeping giant, but a sleeping Maccabee. And they're going to see it in the days and weeks ahead.
Israeli Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer did not say whether there will be a ground invasion, but many Israelis and Palestinians expect one. The crisis in Israel casts a new shadow over the competition between Majority Leader Steve Scalise and Representative Jim Jordan, the two Republicans who want to be the next Speaker of the House. Bloomberg's Jody Schneider has more from Washington.
They're going to have a so-called speaker forum or candidate forum with the two leading candidates for the House Speaker. Then tomorrow they're supposed to take a vote in the conference just among Republicans behind closed doors to see if they have enough to bring it to the floor.
Bloomberg's Jody Schneider says there are already signs the fight could drag on far longer than the vote, which is planned tomorrow. Former Maryland Governor Larry Hogan says come next spring, if it looks like the 2024 presidential election will be a Biden-Trump rematch, he won't close the door to throwing his hat in the ring.
If the country is in that bad a shape next spring and those are the two nominees and it looks like there's a path, I would have no interest in being a spoiler if I thought there was a path to success to win the race. And I just said I wouldn't shut the door.
Hogan joined Bloomberg's Mario Parker in Washington for a newsmaker conversation, during which he also talked about the Israel-Hamas war and the U.S. House speakership. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg. Matt and Paul.
All right, Amy Mars, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Well, the trial of Sam Bankman-Fried continues in Lower Manhattan Federal Courthouse this week. And Sonali Basak, Bloomberg Wall Street reporter for Bloomberg News, she's down there at the courthouse. So later next hour, we're going to have an update from Sonali on that trial as things really start to heat up. Matt.
Carolyn Ellison.
Yeah, I know.
Coming in.
Testifying against.
XGF.
Yep.
And CEO of Alameda Research.
Yeah, that could be a little dicey.
Yeah.
You strike me as a Birkenstock kind of guy.
Do I really? Yes. So I'm not normally, you know, but I did get a pair of Birkenstocks this year for the first time in my life, and I love them.
Love them.
Yes.
Nice. Okay. All right. Very good. Well, the company is scheduled to go public after the markets close today. They're going to price their deal. You know, it's going to after the trading ends today. The German company whose name is synonymous with broad-strapped leather sandals befitting a medieval monk expects to price the offering at the top end of its $44 to $49 per share range when it meets with its advisors on Tuesday. It's according to people familiar with the matter.
Today is Tuesday.
Yep, absolutely, starting today. So we'll see how it prices, see how it trades, and I think what we've seen from some of the other, the prior 3 high-profile IPOs, prices at the high end or above, trades up pretty significantly
for a moment.
The first day,
yeah.
And then pulls back, and you don't get much follow through. So we'll have to see how this one trades as well.
So I feel like this could be a different, you know, because it's not some kind of tech weirdness,
right? And
it's about as old economy as like they sell Jesus sandals, essentially.
Jesus sandals,
you know,
exactly.
So.
Right, we got a private equity owner in there. They're selling as well, about 32 million shares.
El Catterton.
Yep,
it's a big deal private equity owner.
Where are they based? Because I have not heard of them before. Is that a European one?
Well, I meet with them here in New York.
Okay. All right, we'll keep an eye on them. So keep an eye on Birkenstock Holdings, set to go public after the close tonight. We'll keep an eye on it. This is Bloomberg.
Hello. Good morning.
Hola.
Afternoon.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller.
We got a lot of green on the screen here, but the volume is light.
We constantly underestimate the strength of the U.S. consumer.
This is a market that's much more optimistic or bullish than maybe the central bankers are.
Breaking market news and insight from Bloomberg experts.
There's still some concern out there in the market that there is room for things to deteriorate a little bit more than what they're indicating.
As small and medium-sized businesses struggle, they don't present as much competition.
The supply chain has still got dislocations globally and here in the U.S.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, coming up in this hour, we're going to get the latest reporting from Israel. We're going to check in with Israel economy and government reporter with Bloomberg News based in Tel Aviv, Galit Altstein. She's going to give us the latest there. David Katz, president and CIO of Matrix Asset Advisors. She's going to talk to markets, maybe throw us a stock name or two. And then, of course, we're going to speak with Shonali Basak, Bloomberg Wall Street reporter. She is down at the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan for the trial of Sam Bankman-Fried, so she'll have the latest reporting there. So lots to look forward to in this hour. And we're going to kick this whole thing off with Charlie Bell.
All right, I thank you very much, Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller. We've got the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ all advancing at midday, right to the numbers, with the S&P up 46 now at 43.82. That is a gain of 1.1%. Dow Jones Industrial Average up 263 points, up by about 0.8%, while the NASDAQ Composite Index now higher by 163 points, up 1.2%. Stocks rose as Treasury yields fell after comments from Fed officials bolstered speculation the central bank is heading toward another pause in interest rate hikes. 10-year yield at 4.62% with a 2-year 4.93%. Spot gold, little change, down less than 0.1%, virtually flat on the day right now at $18.61 the ounce. And a retreat for crude. Oil is edging lower following its biggest rally since April. West Texas Intermediate down 0.7%, 85.78 a barrel. Brent, the global benchmark, down now by 0.7%, 87.56. Earnings news, PepsiCo raised its growth forecast and reported results that beat expectations. Ken Shea is a senior analyst for beverages, tobacco, and cannabis with Bloomberg Intelligence, and he was a guest right here on Bloomberg Markets.
They lifted their outlook for core EPS, adjusted for currency, up a little bit. And they even went out, unusual for them, and looked out to 24. And they didn't give a lot of detail, but they said that their long-term algorithm, which is mid-single-digit revenue and high single-digit EPS growth, looked like it was going to hit the high end of those ranges.
And you can hear more of the conversation on the Tape podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. PepsiCo shares up 1.4%. Rival Coca-Cola up now by 2.2%. Again, recapping, stocks are higher. S&P up 48, a gain there of 1.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Matt Miller, Paul Sweeney, we're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're also streaming live on YouTube, so head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Radio. UVA football, it is bad this year. I mean, 0-5 to start the year, and then they beat up on the lowly tribe of William and Mary, those fine people there. So now they're 1-5, and they have to go play UNC. Emily Graffeo, you're covering all the markets here for Bloomberg News. What say you about your Wahoo?
Well, I feel like we've always been more of a basketball school.
All right.
So we're going to hold out.
Speaking to a Duke person, that's kind of a stretch, but I'll give it to you.
We're going to hold out hope for November, December, when that season starts.
All right.
But I know, I deserve this.
William and Mary.
Yes. Fernando Valle went to William and Mary.
They have like 5,000 people there, max.
Exactly.
Right? And there's like 25,000 kids at UVA.
Yeah.
Am I wrong?
You would think.
Yeah.
16,000 undergrad about. So.
Huh. Wahoo.
Okay, Cavaliers.
They are. No, we don't do that.
Not the Cavaliers.
They're the Who's. All right, Emily, what do you got for us in this market? Lots of green on the screen there. Lots to choose from on the upside, I'm thinking.
Yeah, I mean, well, it was interesting to look at PepsiCo because the move seems to be fading a little bit. It is the biggest earnings story of the day, I would say, but we're only up about 1.5%. I know, Matt, you said you're interviewing the PepsiCo CEO.
That's true. Where did you hear that?
I was listening to the radio a little bit before this. CFO.
Yep.
So we'll see what they have to say. It's been interesting to watch the analyst reactions, there was obviously a lot of concern about what the rise of weight loss drugs, how that would impact PepsiCo's bottom line. And at least right now, we're seeing most analysts say, okay, for right now, those concerns were a little bit overblown. We had Citi saying the report was strong, should mitigate fears around weight loss drugs, I guess, taking too much from PepsiCo, people losing weight, changing their consumption
Well, did you
habits.
hear, the alternative? So there's the rise of weight loss drugs. Obviously, the more people that take those, fewer people will be chugging Fritos.
Snacks. Right.
But there's also a lot more people, I think, ingesting marijuana in this country.
Okay.
And so they would kind of sway that back
Right.
to the center. Those are the two forces balancing PepsiCo, weed and GLP-1s.
Exactly. Who's going to win that game? I don't know. I just think that whole GLP-1 thing is just overblown, but we'll see. Truist Financial. I mean, it's the worst name for a merged bank of all time. I forget what the bank it was.
It's pretty bad.
Yeah, but a couple southeastern banks. Stock's up pretty big today.
Yeah, up about 7% following a report that they are in talks to sell the rest of their insurance brokerage business to private equity firm Stone Point Capital for about $10 billion.
Nice.
I'm also looking at Hyatt Hotels. That's another single ticker name. The ticker just H. That's up right now about 7.7%. They were named by S&P Dow Jones that they're joining the S&P 400. I'm surprised to see that the stock is up almost 8% just on news that they're joining.
That's big. Everybody's got
S&P
a own it now.
But maybe it also has to do with the fact that people like that ticker, single H. But yeah, Hyatt Hotels right now, fairly small company, about $11 billion in market cap.
I don't know, back in the day, that was a pretty good market cap. I call that a solid mid to...
All right, solid
almost
mid.
When you were a kid. By the way, I'm sort of giggling a little at the Truist description. We have these Hoovers descriptions, historic descriptions, and the company Truist says, formed by the historic merger of equals of BB&T and SunTrust.
Yeah, I think SunTrust was the bigger bank in that one, but BB&T is very good.
Merger of equals? Don't they ever learn? How does Dun & Bradstreet allow this to happen? I don't understand.
Truist, based in Charlotte, North Carolina. So some good stuff there. All right, Emily Grafeo, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Emily Grafeo, she covers all the equities. She is for Bloomberg News. She's also ignoring UVA football this fall. Good news. As my Dukies are going to Charlottesville later in the year to play UVA. So we'll keep an eye on that. Maybe put a little side wager up there, me and Emily.
Does Duke play football?
They do, when we're ranked 17th in the country this year.
You think you'll beat UVA?
I think we'll beat UVA.
What about in basketball?
Oh, we're going to beat.
I don't know.
Actually,
I'm
the
rooting
Hoos
for
are
the
pretty good. The
Wahoos.
Hoos are pretty good, but my Dukies, we got like a bunch more freshmen. But we'll see how that plays out. All right, let's get to the next here. We want to get to the latest here on what is continuing to evolve into a very, very difficult situation. Looks like the fighting in Israel and that part of the world is looking to escalate.
I just imagine the visuals of hundreds of thousands of Israeli troops, angry.
Yes.
And, pumped up, gathering on the border of Gaza. Let's bring in Galit Altstein. She's a Bloomberg reporter for us in Tel Aviv. So, Galit, where do we stand right now in terms of the Israeli response? It feels to me, just reading the news, like that's building and building like water behind a dam and just raring to burst.
Yes, I think you summed it up pretty well, actually. We're hearing from IDF spokespeople today that the focus now is on aerial attacks over Gaza. They're speaking about unprecedented attacks over the past 36 hours that are taking place by rounds. Every 4 hours, they go to strike different targets. And they tell us, and this is a slightly different rhetoric than we've heard until today, that they're acting on every small bit of intelligence, meaning they're not hesitating. And they're also telling us that because these aerial attacks are so massive at this point, then they're very short on the sort of surveillance equipment that they've used in the past to make sure that the area is relatively clear of, people who are not involved, of civilians, obviously. And they're telling us, yes, we're very stretched out on that because we're bombarding Gaza this hard, and they're saying this, officially on the record. So that's what they say is the main focal point now. But it is, like you said, obvious that they're preparing for a much bigger ground operation. They are mobilizing troops towards the south of Israel. They're talking to us today about 4 divisions, which is tens of thousands of soldiers. They're now, I assume, gathering, in what is called assembly areas by the Gaza fence, awaiting command, on what's coming next.
Galit, is there any sense as to the timing when that may start? No, so I'm a military expert in the sense, that I'm not a military officer or general, but it's common to say that in these attacks the surprise factor is typically very important. So I don't know how much of a surprise we're going to have here, but obviously in that sense they're keeping cards very close to their chests. They're not giving out any information on that, but you do see all the preparations that are happening around Gaza, and I think everyone in Israel and in Gaza is waiting on that to happen at this point.
We hear, the majority of the attacks came out of Gaza. We hear reports of shelling coming from the south of Lebanon. We don't hear too much about the West Bank. And I think for a lot of Americans have difficulty understanding just the geography of the region. So the West Bank is much bigger than Gaza, but it's not the kind of walled off Palestinian area, right? I believe about 40% of the people in the West Bank are Israelis. So tell us about the West Bank and what's the state of affairs there.
Yeah, so the West Bank at this point is relatively contained. There are incidents here and there that are happening, but they're not getting a lot of focus. They're not getting a lot of attention, not because someone is not talking about this, but because they're very contained at this stage. The main arenas that are now very much on fire, I would say, are Gaza and the northern front, which is not on fire, but by the way, I don't want to mislead on that, on what I just said. The northern front is seeing some mortar fire and some missile launches, but we're speaking for now about very small numbers. The IDF says today that they have seen 15 launches from Lebanese territory, and they have retaliated on that, but that is now pretty much contained. As you well know, everyone is looking to see what happens there. For now, it is very well contained. And just to go back to your question, so Judea and Samaria are now relatively quiet, if you compare them to everything that is going on everywhere else.
Galit, just give us a sense, just from your conversations with your family, friends, co-workers there in Israel, what's the mood as it relates to how aggressive you think Israel should be in its retaliation here? What are people kind of feeling these days?
It's funny you ask that, because every conversation that at least I or people that I know are having in Israel these days starts out typically with a question of how are you? Are you okay? How are you holding up? You don't just get to the point of what you want to ask the person you're speaking to, because you do not know if that person hasn't had a relative or family member or friend that has been killed or missing in these massive terrorist attacks that we've seen on Saturday. So that's one thing. People are still, I think, in shock. They're still taking everything in. Some are still sad or don't believe what has happened. And I think that the overall public sentiment, if you can generalize, is that yes, people are very upset. They're very united. They're very supportive of the army and what it's doing and what it's saying that it's going to do. And yeah, so you get a sense of of unity and of anger and sadness and frustration. And I have to say that in all of that, because it's very complex, some people, they're also very concerned of the situation that Israel will be, in war for quite a few weeks or maybe even several months. And what happens if it doesn't just, end up with Gaza being a front and the south of Israel being a front, but also the north being a front. And for many Israeli civilians, that in a way is a much bigger threat, with Hezbollah having a very, very large number of missiles that are, basically pointed at almost every point, I think, every area in Israel that you can imagine.
Galit, what is it like on the ground in Tel Aviv? Do you see other Arabs on a regular basis? Do you see Palestinians and interact with them? After these really barbaric attacks, I just wonder what it's like on the day-to-day basis when you're interacting with people from both sides.
Yeah. So you don't get to see Palestinians typically in Tel Aviv, unless and this is not the case so much right now, because unless they have work permits here, so you don't usually. People in Tel Aviv don't bump into Palestinians in every day. But it is an interesting question, because we have in Tel Aviv, we have a part of the city that is called Jaffa. And many Arabs, Israeli Arabs, live there. And you know that Israeli Arabs, at least some of them, if not most of them, do relate, with the Palestinians for historical reasons and with the Palestinian cause. And we've seen that in past operations, military operations in Gaza, that were much smaller scale than what we're seeing now or what we anticipate to see in the very near future. So we've seen people at places like Jaffa, where you have a mixed population of Arabs, Israeli Arabs, and Jews. We've seen them light up very quickly in recent years, with protests, with violence even, with the situation being very complex in Israeli cities like that. We see it in Tel Aviv, we see it in Haifa, which is a city like that, and in other places. And I have to say that in that sense, and I don't know if it's very surprising or not, it is a little bit surprising at least, we do not see those tensions now. I mean, it is very quiet in mixed cities that, like I said, populate both Arabs and Jews. We'll see where that goes, but for now it is relatively quiet.
All right, Galit, thank you so much for joining us. Galit Altstein, economy and government reporter in Israel, in Tel Aviv, for Bloomberg News. So stay safe particularly these next several days, where it looks like really things are going to escalate pretty significantly there. And of course, we'll keep current reporting all the time as we do. Looking at the markets right here, S&P 500 up 1.1%, so a pretty strong move here in the equity markets today. The Nasdaq's up 1.2%. Big driver there, yields coming in. The 10-year Treasury off about 17 basis points, 4.63% on your 10-year. The 2 years off about 13 basis points, 4.95%. So now firmly below that 5% threshold that had spent most of the last several weeks above. WTI crude oil off a little bit here, $86 a barrel. We're going to have more coming up. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news right now with Lisa Mateo.
Paul, as United Auto Workers enter week 4 of their strike against the big 3 car makers, the pressure is on the rise for GM. Bloomberg's Gina Cervetti explains why.
Workers at General Motors' Canadian plants are going on strike at key factories in Ontario after contract negotiations with the union for about 4,300 employees failed to bring about an agreement. The union there had been trying to get GM to match a 3-year deal it signed with Ford that includes wage increases, cost of living allowances, and pension improvements.
Shares right now up 1.5%. Meanwhile, the Hollywood screenwriters strike has come to an end. The Writers Guild of America says members overwhelmingly voted in favor of a new 3-year contract. The Screen Actors Guild is still negotiating. And workers at another pharmacy chain have walked off the job. Bloomberg's Kimberly Adams has that story.
Walgreens pharmacists staged a walkout just weeks after similar action by CVS staffers in Kansas City. The pharmacists say the company places unreasonable demand on workers without providing the staffing or resources to do their jobs safely or ethically. That walkout on Monday left stores closed or short-staffed across the nation's second largest retail pharmacy chain. Organizers expect this walkout to last through Wednesday.
Walgreens right now up almost 1%. And Walmart is betting that online doctors will help it ease its $6 billion healthcare tab. The retailer is partnering with Included Health to offer virtual primary care visits to about 1 million people on its employee health insurance plan. Right now, shares of Walmart, they are up more than 1%. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Lisa Mateo, and this is Bloomberg.
Connection lost.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We've got the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ all advancing. S&P holding very close to session highs with a gain right now of 46 points, up 1.1%. S&P at 43.82. The Dow is advancing 262 points, up by about 0.8%. NASDAQ, the composite index, up 155 points, up now by 1.2%. 10-year yield 4.63%, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.95%. We've got spot gold at $18.59 the ounce, down 0.1%. West Texas Intermediate crude 86.07 a barrel. Crude is lower today by about 0.4%. Stocks higher as Treasury yields fell after comments from Fed officials bolstered speculation that the central bank is heading toward another pause in interest rate increases. Boeing says it delivered 27 commercial jets in September, marking the third consecutive month that shipments have declined as manufacturing glitches put its annual target in jeopardy. So again, recapping, stocks are moving higher. S&P up now by 45 points, up 1%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Matt Miller, Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. Markets moving higher today. I guess the market's saying, boy, if the Fed's not there now, they're pretty darn close to being at peak rates. We're seeing it in the bond market, too. You've got the 10-year Treasury up over, 1 and 7/32, pushing those yields down.
Well, and that's also great for stocks. I mean, this is the third day in a row of risk asset gains, and I think it's interesting that you could put it all down to the Fed and this horrendous atrocity in the Middle East. I think everyone agrees is scary and depressing, but investors aren't really doing much about it. I mean, they didn't bid up oil that much. I guess they to some extent are piling into treasuries, but that's probably due to Fed speak, and all of that is just pushing equities up.
Let's bring in David Katz. He's the president and chief investment officer of Matrix Asset Advisors. David, so many crosswinds for investors to deal with, and you know, we've talked about it before, whether it's the Fed or earnings or geopolitics, and now you throw in what's happening in Israel. As you step back here, you know, on this Tuesday, how do you view the next, I don't know, 3, 6, 12 months in these markets?
So I think the next 3 to 12 months are actually going to be pretty good. In order to get there, you've got to ignore a lot of this short-term uncertainty. We think there's going to be a lot of volatility. We think the market's reaction this week of going higher on the lower interest rates and overlooking the conflict in Israel is sort of surprising. We think at some point the market might wake up and sell off a little bit on fears that the war could escalate and go into other areas of the region. So we wouldn't chase this rally. However, if you have that 3 to 12 month time horizon, we think that the general outlook is pretty good for stocks. We think there are a lot of stocks at 12 to 16 times earnings. We think the economy is going to be okay. And we do think the Fed is going to pause shortly. And we do think they're probably going to lower rates a little bit more than they're currently letting on if the economy does slow down. And we think that environment is pretty good.
What do you think pushes the Fed to cut rates for the first time? Is it a jump in unemployment, a bad NFP report?
Well, there are a lot of overhangs in the economy right now that we think ultimately will slow the economy, whether it's a government shutdown, students having to start repay their loans. The employment numbers were robust this last month, but in general have been slowing a little bit. Higher oil prices, the uncertainty globally could slow things down. So there are lots of things out there. We think they ultimately will all lead the U.S. economy to slow some. And if inflation numbers come down, which we do expect them to continue to do, it gives the Fed the ability to start to lower rates to offset a slowing economy. So very difficult to figure out the catalyst, but we do think it happens sometime next year. We don't think it happens early in the year, but when it starts, we think it's going to be more than 2 decreases. We think it will be multiple decreases.
Hey, David, when you look at the SPX, it's up about 15% this year. But when you look at the equal-weighted S&P, the SPW, kind of flattish, maybe up 1% here. Do I chase some of those growthy stocks, or do I try to find some laggards here, maybe look for some value?
So that's a great question. We think that the market is going to rotate. We would not chase this year's winners. We would not chase the Magnificent Seven, although we think they can go up higher. But we do think a lot of the lagging stocks and a lot of the lagging groups are poised to lead the market over the next 6 to 12 months. And that's where we'd suggest putting that new money. In addition, as many of those stocks haven't done well and they're selling at lower valuations, we think you're protecting yourself on the downside as well.
What are some of those lower valuation stocks? Where can I find a 12, 13, 14 PE and go in there expecting that valuation to rise?
So utilities have been creamed this year. They're down about 20 to 25%. So a company like AEP sells at 14 times earnings and about a 4.5% yield. They grow those earnings at about 7-8% a year. So good business, good growth, very fair valuation. The drug and the healthcare sector has done miserably this year after a good year last year. We think there are lots of opportunities there. A company like Medtronic, Pfizer, Zimmer, all at very reasonable valuations, good 12 to 18-month outlooks. A number of them pay very healthy yields. So those would be two types of things. The financial sector has also done poorly this year. So you've got to have a little bit stronger stomach to buy some of those financials. But within the group, we like Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Bank of New York. Those are lower risk plays. And then, you know, sort of scattered throughout the market, industrials like a Union Pacific, real good. Starbucks has done pretty poorly. We think that's an opportunity. So lots of places in the market, if you take a longer time horizon, willing to put up with a little bit short-term volatility. And we think that's the greatest likelihood for success is to try to find the opportunities rather than play the market in aggregate.
And David, you know, I guess defense stocks had a move yesterday based on the news coming out of the Middle East. I mean, is that a sector you want to play longer term, or is that just a trade? How do you think about that defense space?
So we've been building our positions in defense. General Dynamics and L3 Harris are two places that we're putting money, a little bit in RTX. So they got a bounce yesterday, but they still have done poorly this year and have a good 2 to 4 year outlook. Unfortunately, the world is not a safe place. Defense spending is going to go up significantly for the U.S., for NATO. So the stocks bounced yesterday like 8%. We wouldn't chase them today, but if they were to pull back half of what they recovered, we do think that they're a very good place to be and would buy the General Dynamics and the L3 Harris.
Does the Hamas attack in Israel and the expected response make a difference in your investment outlook?
It just causes a much higher level of uncertainty, and we think there could be short-term volatility on the downside as a result of that. If the conflict is limited to Israel and Hamas, we think it's a horrific thing and it's heartbreaking, but it shouldn't affect the financial markets as much. If it were to escalate to the north or ultimately to something with Iran, that would make a much greater deal of uncertainty out there and could affect the markets more, would affect oil prices more.
All right, David, thanks so much for joining us. As always, David Katz, he's the president and CIO at Matrix Asset Advisors. I like talking to David because he's always got some names to talk about that they're buying in the fund. Matt, you've had the Dodge Challenger now for a week, I guess. What's some of the...
Not quite yet, dude.
Okay.
Remember, I picked it up last Thursday afternoon.
Oh, that's
really
right.
evening.
Okay.
So
have you been able to put it through its paces yet?
You're not supposed to. They said you shouldn't drive it more than like 75, 85 miles per hour for the first, I think it's 500 miles, could be a little bit longer. And there's certain aspects of it that, like the performance pages, that don't open up. So I can't look at the dash and see the horsepower and torque figures I'm putting down to the road. Plus, I don't have the summer tires on it. It comes with all seasons rather than, I think, you can get Pirelli summer tires for it. I'm looking for the Michelin Sport Cups. But for right now...
So you really will switch tires?
Oh, yeah. I'll switch tires at least every year. I'll put summer tires on it. In the summer, I'll put winter tires on it. Dude, there's nothing like snow tires. If you... Look, as a lifelong rear-wheel drive vehicle owner should know, they're not great in the snow.
Right.
But if you put winter tires on, if you really put dedicated snow tires on, it's a life-changing event for you. You get so much grip, you might as well be in a four-wheel drive vehicle.
No kidding.
Well, I don't think it's going to be like that with the Challenger, obviously, because it's got a 5,000-pound vehicle putting down 485 horsepower. It's going to still spin the tires when you drop the pedal, but it'll make a big difference.
Okay, but so far so good.
It's so comfortable. It's such a big boat. I keep telling people it's like being in Grand Theft Auto for real. I mean, even the feeling of, if you've ever played Grand Theft Auto, when you push down the trigger on your video game controller, the gas sort of builds up. And then when you let go, it sort of hangs on for a little while. You get that same feeling in this big floaty boat.
How about your neighbors in Tony Westchester? They can't be happy when you start that thing up in the morning.
I'm the only American muscle car in the neighborhood. Let's put it that way. I think there is a BMW rule where I live,
right,
and I've broken it. It's like a little bit loud, a little bit brash. They probably think I'm slightly classless, but I don't care.
You don't care?
No.
Okay, very good. You're comfortable in your own skin. Very good.
Yeah.
S&P 500 holding on to gains this morning, up about 1%, and NASDAQ up 1.2%. So that's good news there on the stock fund. Yields again coming in, 10-year Treasury down about 17 basis points.
463.
463.
At one point last week, it was 488.
Yep, absolutely. And the 2 years now firmly below 5%. So that's good news. Right now, let's head down to Washington, D.C. We'll get world and national news with Nancy Lyons.
Thanks, Paul. President Biden will be speaking within the hour about the ongoing conflict in Israel and the Gaza Strip. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby outlines what the president will be conveying in this speech.
The United States' long-standing and continued support of Israel, of the people of Israel. Our sympathies, obviously, with the loss and the suffering and the shock that they're going through, but also our firm resolve to make sure that they can continue to defend themselves against these terrorist attacks and to take action against Hamas directly.
U.S. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby spoke with Bloomberg Surveillance. The death toll in the war between Israel and Hamas has now surpassed 1,600. That toll is expected to rise as Israel pummels the Gaza Strip with airstrikes and Hamas fires rockets into Israel. Caught in the middle of all this are the families who are struggling to learn the fate of the more than 150 hostages taken by Hamas. Ruby Chen was among the loved ones who held a news conference today in Tel Aviv. He spoke of his missing son, Itai.
The last time that we heard from him was Saturday morning, where he said that they were under attack. We know that he was active, that he was in communication for a while, but since then, silence.
Chen says his son is a member of the military and was serving along Israel's border with Gaza. House Republicans are scrambling to find a new leader following the historic ouster of former Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Republicans will be meeting tonight to hear from candidates running to be the next Speaker. So far, House Majority Leader Steve Scalise and Ohio Congressman Jim Jordan are the only lawmakers who formally entered the race. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. We've got the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ all advancing, holding close to session highs with a 47-point jump right now for the S&P, up by 1.1%. Dow Industrials up 268, up by about 0.8%. The NASDAQ Composite Index up 162, up now by 1.2%. 10-year yield 4.62% with a 2-year that's yielding 4.95%. Gold down 35 cents the ounce to $18.61, and a retreat for West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.4%, $86.04 a barrel. Brent, the global benchmark, at $87.75, down 0.5%. Stocks are gaining as Treasury yields fell after comments from Fed officials bolstered speculation that the central bank is heading toward another pause in interest rate hikes. So, what about the stocks? The gains for stocks in recent sessions and the outlook. David Katz is President and Chief Investment Officer of Matrix Asset Advisors, and he was a guest minutes ago right here on Bloomberg Markets.
We wouldn't chase this rally. However, if you have that 3 to 12 month time horizon, we think that the general outlook is pretty good for stocks. We think there are a lot of stocks at 12 to 16 times earnings. We think the economy is going to be okay, and we do think the Fed is going to pause shortly. And we do think they're probably going to lower rates a little bit more than they're currently letting on if the economy does slow down. But we think that environment is pretty good.
And again, 10-year right now at 4.62%. By the way, you can hear more of that conversation on the Tape podcast. U.S.-listed Chinese shares like Alibaba Group and Baidu climbed after Bloomberg News reported the Asian nation is considering raising its budget deficit amid a new round of economic stimulus. Alibaba up now by 3%, Baidu up by 1.1%, JD.com up now by 3.6%. Workers at General Motors Canadian plants are on strike, idling key factories in Ontario after contract negotiations with the union representing about 4,300 employees failed to bring an agreement. The strike raises pressure on GM, which has already been dealing since mid-September with U.S. strikes by the United Auto Workers. And Walmart's going to be offering online primary care doctors to about 1 million people on its employee health insurance plan in an attempt to improve medical outcomes. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Matt Miller and Paul Sweeney, we're live here in the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're streaming live on YouTube, so go over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Radio. Well, the trial of Sam Bankman-Fried continues in Lower Manhattan, and down in Lower Manhattan at the courthouse is our very own Shonali Basak, who covers all things Wall Street for Bloomberg News, Bloomberg Television. Shonali, where do we stand on this trial? Because I know there are a large number of very key witnesses who are scheduled to testify against Sam Bankman-Fried. Where are we today?
Yeah, and we are hearing from the most pivotal of witnesses as we speak. That is Caroline Ellison, the on again, off again girlfriend of Sam Bankman-Fried, who he met over at his time in Jane Street and eventually made the CEO of Alameda, the hedge fund in question that allegedly siphoned off hundreds of millions of dollars from FTX and its customers. Now, Caroline has taken the stand. She had followed Gary Wang, which is also an FTX co-founder. Both of these people had pled guilty to crimes brought forward by the prosecution. So Caroline herself and Gary were key witnesses. Caroline perhaps the most of all. What we expect to be brought forth as evidence includes her personal diaries, places where she wrote and had been leaked earlier to the New York Times, places where she wrote about her own insecurities as a leader at Alameda and her relationship with Sam Bankman-Fried. The other thing that is expected to be brought forth as evidence is a recording of a pivotal November meeting in which she talked to Alameda staff of the financial troubles at the firm and its relationship to FTX. So we'll see as this afternoon goes on what comes to the surface, but certainly a very tense and frankly awkward moment inside the courtroom right now where Sam Bankman-Fried's former girlfriend is now standing trial and has already pled guilty.
Yeah, it seems really, if I'm the defense, just looking from the defense's perspective, Shonali, having two of the other founders pleading guilty and testifying against Sam Bankman-Fried, you would assume, or you would think, that they would have firsthand knowledge of any and all behavior for Sam Bankman-Fried.
Yeah, and there's actually a third as well. The engineering chief, Nishrad Singh, was expected to take the stand as well. And, you know, when you're listening to Caroline Ellison speak, remember, the reason she's so pivotal is not only because of what she stands for from the prosecution side, but also how the defense might handle her treatment of FTX and Alameda. For example, in the opening remarks, you had heard Sam Bankman-Fried's lawyers say that Sam Bankman-Fried asked her to make certain moves in hedging positions over at Alameda, which she did not do. Why does that matter? Is because you're going to hear the defense try to remove Sam Bankman-Fried from a lot of the operations at Alameda, of which he had been a large shareholder, but stepped back allegedly from day-to-day operations. Whereas the prosecution says, you know, he knew all along. And so this is a lot of, this is a lot for both sides that will happen in this very specific testimony. Though, to your point, this is week 2 of a 6-week trial. So a lot more where that came from.
Shonali, what do we know, if anything, about the defense that Sam Bankman-Fried and his team are likely to put up here?
Well, there's a few things here. The prosecution alleges that this was a scheme that was orchestrated knowingly to take customer funds in large part without them knowing. Now, when it comes to Sam Bankman-Fried's side of the argument, the defense being put forward is it was very normal. Have you ever heard of a margin loan? This idea that you could take a loan from FTX into Alameda, his hedge fund, just like any other customer would. Now, what we're hearing from Gary Wang and from Caroline Ellison, that the extent to which funds were taken into Alameda from FTX were far more than any normal customer would have taken, and that it was not always known by customers the extent to which their funds were used in Alameda, and used by, at that point, from Alameda's own employees, Gary Wang himself, who allegedly took between $200 to $300 million worth of loans. Sam Bankman-Fried, who also was allegedly taking hundreds of millions of dollars to pay for real estate and other personal assets. And so, yeah, Sam will say these are normal loans. Or the defense, rather, will say that. But the testimonies from the other ones of his colleagues who were aware of what was going on say a very different story.
Shonali, I guess it's a little bit, unclear to what extent Sam Bankman-Fried's parents, who are professors at Stanford, that they were involved here. What's their role going to be in this trial? Do we know?
Support. We don't know whether either Sam or his parents will be asked to testify in any manner. The judge at the opening of the trial had reminded Sam Bankman-Fried that he certainly has the right to testify should he want to. But, of course, lawyers typically advise you not to testify in a case like this. We've heard a lot from him himself. One thing that's been showing up in this trial also is this idea that he had made. Do you remember that series of tweets he made back in November? Sure. Everything is fine. Actually, I was joking around. Somebody bought me a T-shirt that says "What?" That thing is "What?" That tweet that he had. And, you know, now what's happening is his friends are saying everything was not fine, and he knew it. So it's not clear what role his parents had played in the extent of all of this. They have shown up, at least in previous days of trial. I did not see them personally walk in, but they may be in there themselves right now. And so, you know, unclear overall in his parents' role. And by the way, his brother is also slated to potentially testify. His brother had ran his foundation and guided a lot of his political donations, which had come into question in the course of a lot of these accusations or a lot of these criminal counts. Remember, they had revoked the political financing charge of the DOJ that had earlier been made against Sam Bankman-Fried.
All right, Shonali, thank you so much for that. We really appreciate your on-site reporting there. Shonali Basak, she is our Wall Street reporter for Bloomberg News, Bloomberg Television. She is down in Lower Manhattan at the federal court building for the trial of Sam Bankman-Fried, which is now in week 2. The prosecution is presenting its case to be followed up by the defense, and then we'll see how this thing plays out. So very, very big moment, not just for the individuals involved, but really for the crypto space in general. There are a lot of people that want to see justice done there and perhaps lend some greater credibility to that space. Looking at the markets here real quick, continue to hold gains here. S&P 500, that's up 1%. The NASDAQ up 1.1%. The VIX now below 17, 16.69 on the VIX. Yields come in, 10-year Treasury, 4.61% on your 10-year Treasury. We're going to have more coming up. This is Bloomberg. go to Lisa Mateo and get some company news.
Thanks, Paul. More evidence that the post-pandemic luxury boom is fading. Sales growth at LVMH softened in the third quarter as shoppers reined in spending on high-end cognac and pricey handbags. Its fashion and leather goods unit rose only 9%, while revenue in wines and spirits, that dropped 14%. LVMH shares right now, they're up just a fraction. And sales of Mercedes-Benz luxury vehicles like the S-Class slumped in the third quarter. Orders of high-end Mercedes vehicles dropped 11% to nearly 70,000 units compared to the same period a year ago. Global sales of the S-Class, that fell 18%, while sales in China fell 12%. Mercedes shares right now up about 1%. And PepsiCo beat estimates and is raising its profit forecast as consumers paid more for its snacks and beverages. Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle adds that appetite-suppressing drugs haven't affected sales.
Walmart disclosed that they think that they're seeing less demand for food as consumers are shopping less for food as they are taking these appetite-suppressant drugs, causing people to want to eat less. Pepsi is saying they are not seeing that, but they're on the outlook for it. And if they were to see it, maybe they would change to smaller snacks or different snacks along those lines. In fact, they've actually raised the full-year view.
Now, PepsiCo right now up about 2%. And Birkenstock's initial public offering is expected to price after the trading day today. The German sandal maker expected to price the offering at the top of its $44 to $49 per share range. It's looking to sell about 32 million shares to raise as much as $1.58 billion. And that would value the company at roughly $9.2 billion. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Lisa Mateo. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Matt Miller, Paul Sweeney here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. At 1 p.m. Wall Street time today, President Biden is scheduled to deliver remarks on the situation in Israel. When that happens, we will bring that to you. In a couple of minutes we have before that, we want to check in with Jordan Fabian, White House reporter for Bloomberg News. Jordan, what do we know from the White House, from the president, about their reaction to what is happening in Israel?
Well, the president has repeatedly condemned the Hamas attacks. We're expected to hear from him again at 1 p.m. in just a few minutes, talking about, again, condemning the violence that we've seen and also what the U.S. might do to provide assistance for Israel in what looks to be a protracted fight against Hamas in the Gaza Strip.
Jordan, what are those options, do you believe, or what have you heard from your sources about what those options really can be in terms of supporting Israel?
Well, there's like what's called drawdown authority right now. So the president has some money to spend on things like replenishing the Iron Dome system in Israel, which is their defense system against rocket attacks. The U.S. has already sent a carrier group to the Eastern Mediterranean as an effort to deter Hezbollah, which is in Lebanon, which is to Israel's north, from entering the conflict. But beyond that, if there's going to be a long conflict, the U.S. will probably need more money, and for that, they will need Congress to act. The problem right now is there's no Speaker of the House, and so efforts on that front are frozen.
So, I think one of the concerns out there are many concerns, obviously, but one of the concerns is the role of Iran to date and maybe going forward. Has the White House put out any comments about that?
Iran's long been known to be a backer both financially and militarily of Hamas. There's been some news reports about possible coordination between Hamas leadership and the Iranian government about plotting this attack. The Biden administration has said they don't have any information confirming that there was coordination about this specific attack, but the alliance is obviously there, and you can see how it would be in Iran's interest for this attack to be carried out.
Have we learned anything yet about the apparent failure here of intel on part of the West, not just Israel, but the West in general? Has there been any discussion or commentary from the White House, or is that something that you think the president may address?
I don't expect him to address it in this speech. He might get asked about it by a reporter. Jake Sullivan's going to talk at the briefing room afterwards. I'm sure he will be pressed on it. But there's no denying that there was something missed here. There was clearly something missed when Hamas, which previously was believed to be contained or not wanting to carry out this aggressive of an operation, is pouring over the borders of Gaza, evading that so-called smart fence that Israel has around it, taking bulldozers to barrel over the wall and using paragliders. I mean, this was a coordinated assault using very complicated means, and so clearly something was missed, whether that was they didn't have the intelligence or they had the intelligence but the leaders didn't digest it. We'll find out in the coming months, but there was clearly some missed signals.
And just about 30 seconds left here. Anything that the president can say as it relates to Congress and just in terms of responding here?
I'm sure the president is going to urge Congress to elect a speaker as soon as possible so they can get on with the business of the country, which not only includes getting more aid and weapons to Israel, but also to Ukraine, which is still embroiled in the war with Russia. So I would expect the president to address that situation here at 1 p.m.
All right, Jordan, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Jordan Fabian, he's a White House reporter for Bloomberg News. Again, we're waiting on President Biden. He's scheduled to make some comments about the war in Israel at 1 p.m. Eastern time. There's oftentimes delays there, but when the president comes and makes those comments, we will bring those to you. S&P 500 up a solid 1%. NASDAQ up 1.1%. Yields coming in. 10-year Treasury is now trading at 4.62%. Sound On with Joe Matthew in Washington, D.C. That is coming up right now.
Now, our nation's capital. This is Bloomberg Sound On.
The Biden administration says we're making good on a long-held promise. Ballooning budget deficits in Washington. We're in a bizarro political world here.
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
Most people, including most Republicans in Congress, understand that we need to get aid to Ukraine.
Who's going to take us in a rational way into the future and lead our country?
This has really become kind of the new frontier in American politics, is this battle between red states and blue cities.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
It's day 4 in Israel, where the death toll is now approaching 2,000. Welcome to the fastest show in politics, as Israel prepares for the next phase of its retaliation against Hamas, which has already brought hundreds of deaths as well in Gaza. We'll talk about the strategies at hand now for the Israelis, as well as potential U.S. involvement with the former Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper. He'll be with us in just a moment. We're standing by to hear from President Biden. He'll be addressing the situation in Israel from the White House. We'll bring you his remarks live and discuss with our signature panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are with us for the hour. And we start, as always, with a look at Wall Street. Let's get to trading right now in New York and Charlie Pellet. Hey, Charlie. All right, we're going to stand by on Charlie and bring you back to the markets a bit later on here, as we do want to be ready for President Biden here at the White House. So welcome to the Tuesday edition of Sound On. As we wait to hear from the president, as I mentioned, set to address the nation from the state dining room, and we do have a sense that he will be obviously condemning the attacks from Hamas, but it's unclear exactly what he's going to say about a potential supplemental request for funding, to what extent the U.S. will lean into this. We know we have, of course, a carrier strike group that's on its way to Israel right now, and that's where we begin our conversation with Mark Esper, Chairman, National Security Partner at Red Cell Partners. As we've told you, he is also author of the New York Times best-selling memoir, A Sacred Oath. And Mr. Secretary, I welcome you back to Bloomberg. It's great to have you. We're reporting on the terminal now that the buildup of forces is getting to be something of note here as Israel stands by for the next phase. And I wonder what you see in the days ahead as the next phase in this retaliation against Hamas.
Yeah, Joe, good afternoon. First of all, good to be with you and your viewers and listeners. Look, at this point in time, I think the Israeli Defense Forces certainly need to make sure that all militants in Israel have been killed or captured. The reports are that that has been accomplished. Second, we see that they're massing forces now. They've called up the reserves, 360,000 or so. You see heavy equipment coming in, tanks, armored personnel carriers, etc. It will take them, a few days, short days to again, muster, mobilize, brief plans, and then be prepared to move into Gaza. In the meantime, what they really have to do is tamp down on this rocket fire coming out of Gaza. As we speak, Hamas is shooting rockets into Ashkelon, have been doing so for a couple hours or so, continue to pummel Israeli towns and cities. So I think those are the next few steps as we look at it. Politically, Bibi Netanyahu's already come out and talked about forming a unity government. That's a good move. Obviously lining up supporters globally. I think that's one of the things we'll hear about from President Biden when he comes on. But there's this political international dynamic that needs to happen as well, particularly warning off would-be opportunists such as Syria, Iran, and other groups like Hezbollah.
We see today Boeing speeding 1,000 smart bombs to Israel following the attacks. Mr. Secretary, to what extent can we transfer weapons now, either from our stockpiles here in the U.S. or our stockpiles in Israel, without going to Congress, without further delay?
Well, we do have some stockpiles presently in Israel, so that's available, and we can move other munitions from throughout the region and, of course, from the United States. But, the munitions, precision-guided munitions in particular, will be a top request for the Israelis. Actually, atop of that will be intelligence, both tactical with regard to what's happening on the ground in Gaza, around Gaza, but also strategic, what's happening in the region, making sure that we got our eyes and ears out about what other moves countries might make. So I think intelligence, munitions, maybe air defense might be another request as well. And of course, as you mentioned up front, the presence of the carrier strike group in the Eastern Mediterranean sends a very, very powerful message of support for Israel, but also deterrence, again, from others who might want to act here in the coming days and weeks.
Are there guardrails on transferring weapons from our stockpiles in Israel to the Israelis? Are there guardrails on using them in Gaza? Of course, a heavily populated area that's full of civilians.
Well, the transfer or sale of weapons from the United States to Israel, it's something that's been happening for decades. We know it very well. Of course, I think the United States provides over $3 billion a year in assistance to Israel, good chunk of that military. So we know what they need. We know what's been approved in the past. We always expect those to whom we sell, provide weapons will act so in accordance with the laws of war and the Geneva Conventions. The Israelis, the IDF is a very professional military force. We're confident they take great care to avoid civilian casualties and unnecessary harm. That's going to be difficult to do in Gaza, of course, because of the density of that area, but also the fact that Hamas uses humans to include not just the Israelis they've captured, but Palestinians as well, to hide within those densely populated areas, putting weapons where they shouldn't, such as in schools and whatnot. So it's a challenge in that place when you're dealing with Hamas.
It's been pretty remarkable seeing the Iron Dome in action over these past 4 days. Mr. Secretary, you know all about it. I mean, they're obviously dealing with overwhelming numbers of rockets, but they've repelled an incredible number of them. I think most would suggest that it's a success, and at some point they're going to need many more missiles to make up for those that have already been used. This is something that came up with Kevin McCarthy, the former speaker, yesterday, and I'll play you something that he said in a moment, but I wonder how quickly, I believe Raytheon helps to make those missiles in partnership with an Israeli company. How speedy could those be replaced?
Yeah, I don't know the exact number, but it's not like you're making donuts. They don't go in at night and come out in the morning. I mean, these things take weeks, if not months, has been my experience, many months to build missiles. So I'm sure Israel has stockpiled a good deal. But as you said, when Hamas is shooting 3,000, 4,000 rockets in a 2-3 day period, you have to have a lot of stockpile because not every interceptor hits. Although it's a great system, right? A 90% success rate. But if you figure if you're shooting at 1,000 missiles and you hit 90%, that means 100 are getting through. And so not perfect, very good. I think it's when you complement that with Israeli warning systems and bunkers and whatnot, it goes a long way. But clearly you have to continue production. We have to accelerate that. Keep in mind that Hezbollah has well over 100,000 rockets and missiles in southern Lebanon. Estimates have been as high as 140 or 150,000. That can easily overwhelm Iron Dome, particularly if you fire, hundreds and hundreds at once. So it's a big concern, and we're not even talking about Iran yet, too. So it's something that we have to accelerate on our end, and I'm sure they are doing on theirs as well.
Yeah, so when Kevin McCarthy was asked yesterday about potential supplemental funding for Ukraine, potential supplemental funding for Israel, and also replenishing our own munitions, I thought it was an interesting turn that he took here, and I'd love for you to listen to what he said and respond when it comes to, and something that you know about intimately, the supply chain and the manufacturing chain on these weapon systems. Here's Kevin McCarthy.
Right now, Ukraine still has another $9 billion that they can draw down sitting there for arms. The question comes now in our stockpiles. We need a whole new ability for the procurement and movement of the building of our weapons. It's too slow, it takes too long, and we've watched others try to take advantage of it.
Secretary Esper, I wonder your thoughts on that. What needs to be done now, knowing that the push and pull from Ukraine and Israel are not going to be going away anytime soon, and there will be continued major asks here of the U.S. and requests for supplemental funding to create these weapons, but we don't have the infrastructure to make them. What needs to be done?
Well, you have to go back in time. I mean, the speed by which we produce, deliver, order weapons, equipment is too slow, not just for what Israel is asking or Ukraine is asking for, but for what the United States military itself needs. And look, there are two guilty players here. One is the Pentagon with the slowness of contracting and determined requirements and building their budgets and sorting through this and that. But then it goes to Capitol Hill. And Capitol Hill is an 18-month process, right? And then they put restrictions on how many can be built. And they don't allow multi-year purchases in many cases that could not just give predictability to industry, but also lower the price per unit for the United States taxpayer. So all hands are dirty on this. We certainly need a new system. I think the defense industrial base, if we're willing to make the investments in it, to have sufficient, not just in time delivery, but just more than enough delivery as well, so we have ample room in case we get into a bigger fight with China. So I think there's a lot of investment needed. But if you look at the defense budget of the past few years, each budget submitted by President Biden has been below inflation. So it's been a cut in real terms. And then the budget cap is that was recently agreed to in the last several months also imposes a cap. And next year will be even further, smaller. So defense is not keeping up with the needs of what the world is presenting us. The threats are far greater than the supply. And I think it's not just more money. Well, I've always argued for 3 to 5% annual real growth. We certainly need that. But we also need reforms to both how Congress works and how DOD works. I co-chair a commission at the Atlantic Council that is focused just on that. I work in the venture capital space. I see it from the innovator's perspective. We are way too slow, too bureaucratic. And it's not just the Pentagon that's in the way, but it's the White House and it's Congress too.
Well, in the meantime, sir, it's going to be door-to-door fighting, it appears, in Gaza with a hostage rescue operation underway. God knows what is going to follow when we consider the idea of a ground invasion. What is it that Israel actually needs? Obviously, Hamas doesn't have an air force. What are the tools required for this job?
Well, I think in terms of munitions requests, it's going to be smart weapons, particularly, precision bombs, small bombs that don't create as much collateral damage, such as the small diameter bomb and so on. But look, the bigger question is, what does Israel aim to do? Are they going to go in to punish Hamas by decapitating the leadership, knocking out command centers, destroying stockpiles? Are they going in there to create more of a buffer within the Gaza Strip itself to push back the settlements even further? Or are they going to go into occupy to make sure that Hamas doesn't rise up again? And each one of those has pros and cons. Clearly, I think the sentiment is nobody wants to do another because of another occupation of Gaza. But I think that has to be defined first. And then the big complicating factor here is that Hamas is holding somewhere between 130 to 150 Israelis hostage, and they promised to start killing them on TV, filming it if Israel continues to attack without warning civilian sites. And of course, that would include an incursion into Gaza. So it's very complicated for the Israelis. What do they do? How do they conduct this war in a manner consistent with the laws of war and whatnot when they're dealing with a barbaric enemy who doesn't follow any rules and is holding their people hostage? And some, by the way, we suspect of those hostages are foreign nationals, to include possibly Americans. So it's real complicated. This is not an easy situation for the Israelis at all, and for anybody for that matter.
Isn't. It sure isn't. So to what extent then does the Gerald Ford Carrier Group actually play a role in all of this? We're talking about precision maneuvering in a congested urban environment. Where does an aircraft carrier come into play, or is that simply about projecting American strength?
I think first and foremost, that's about projecting American support and confidence in Israel. It's a very muscular, visible thing to do. Second, it's about deterring adversaries, particularly nation states like Syria, like Iran, from doing anything trying to take advantage of the situation. Third, it does give us, of course, capability between the carrier and then the cruiser and four destroyers that are accompanying the carrier to provide firepower, long-range missiles, strike aircraft if something were to go awry. But I think the other thing it more likely provides is a platform by which we can conduct non-combatant evacuation operations for Americans. And if worse comes to worse, we actually have the capability to use those ships as platforms to go in and conduct hostage rescue missions alongside with side by side with the Israelis. So I think it provides a number of functions, but first and foremost, it's about sending a powerful signal to Israel and to Israel's adversaries in the region.
To what extent it is also potentially for a widening conflict, the long game, worst case scenario?
Well, the long game is that the roots to this operation, not just the funding and the arming and the training, but actually the planning and the green lighting, are positively, definitively determined to go back to Iran. Then I think it's a much bigger game. It's now could be a regional conflict, depending on how Israel responds or wants to respond. They can't take on too much at once. But in that case, you can suspect that we will be providing more support. You know, the tell here for me would be more American forces, particularly strike aircraft and air defense systems, moving into the region. That tells us that something bigger may be up. And look, at the end of the day, all roads lead back to Iran. They're funding all this terrorism throughout the region, whether it's Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, Shiite militia groups in Iraq, or Shia groups in other countries. It all goes back to them. We've been dealing with this for 40 years. You're never going to get rid of it until you deal with the Ayatollah once and for all.
Well, there you have it from the former Secretary of Defense. Mark Esper is now a partner and board member at Red Cell Partners, and of course, author of the book A Sacred Oath. It's great to have you back, Mr. Secretary, and appreciate your insights here at an important time as we assemble our panel. Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributor, with us, as well as Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributor in New York. We're going to get to hear from both of them. Jeannie, I'm going to start with you as we stand by for President Biden. What does he need to say today from the White House?
He needs to express sympathy and empathy for all of the victims and their families. That is critical. He needs to express, again, rock solid support for Israel, our closest ally in the region. He needs to condemn what Hamas has done, and he needs to express full U.S. support for whatever it takes to help Israel in this moment of distress. Beyond that, I think he needs to rally the American people. This is particularly important. I have just been talking to young people. You look at college campuses across the country, there are some very divergent opinions on this issue as it pertains to the treatment of the Palestinians. He needs to address that. It is something we are going to hear an awful lot about. The fear of many supporters of Israel is that you go forward in a few weeks, a few months, support that is now very robust will diminish as we see Israel do what it needs to do to take care of Hamas. So these are very real concerns for the president and the administration.
Rick Davis with me here in Washington. How much of a hard line, then, does Joe Biden need to take today?
Look, I think that he's got to be pretty tough. There's been a deafening silence from the administration so far on this. I mean, they've obviously said the minimum basic requirements for support for Israel. I think the president needs to put this in the context of where the United States is in the world and how dangerous it is.
We're going to take the deep dive with our panel coming up, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. As we stand by for the president, we will bring you his remarks from the White House live as well, here on the radio and on YouTube. Search Bloomberg Global News. The cameras are lit here on another important day in Washington. We haven't even mentioned the battle for Speaker yet. We'll get to all of it ahead. I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg with the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ very much in the green. We begin with crude oil. It is retreating today, down by 0.3%, 86.13 a barrel on West Texas Intermediate crude traded here in New York. Brent, 87.88 a barrel. That is the global benchmark, and Brent down now by 0.3%. Stocks rose, Treasury yields fell after comments from Fed officials bolstered speculation that the central bank is heading toward another pause in interest rate increases. The S&P is up 30 at 43.65. That is a gain now of 0.7%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up 181 points, up by 0.5%. NASDAQ up 89, a gain of 0.7%. 10-year yield 4.63% with a 2-year 4.95%, and spot gold little changed on the day, up now by 3 cents at 18.61 the ounce. So again, recapping, stocks are advancing. S&P up 30, up 0.7. 10-year yield 4.63%. Crude oil down 0.3%, 86.16 a barrel. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
President Biden set to address the nation from the White House, 23 minutes ago. Clearly, things have been delayed because we've just learned that he's been on a phone call with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris on this call, which might mean that we'll hear from him shortly as we know the call has ended. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington with our panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano with us, Bloomberg Politics contributors, trying to understand the way forward here. Rick, you were making the point that the president needs to take a pretty hard line today, and I suspect that getting off the phone with Benjamin Netanyahu would go a long way to getting him to that point.
That's right. And I think that, we're in a bipolar world situation. We're very much in competition with our adversaries, China, Russia, Iran. And this is a hot war that Iran has either inspired or instigated. And so in that context, we see a lot of storm clouds gathering, whether it's in Lebanon with Hezbollah, what's already happened with Hamas. And ultimately, we're going to have to deal with Iran on all this. And so the president needs to start to set the stage that this is not just a Hamas incursion into Israel, but this is a competition that we have going on around the world. We have a hot war in Ukraine, now a hot war in Israel. Yeah. We have a lot of tensions around Taiwan. I mean, I don't want to take the attention away from Israel, but the president needs to understand, communicate to the American public that we live in dangerous times, and these are our adversaries. They're not our competitors, right? They're our adversaries. And we need to start thinking about what we need to be prepared to do. We have these lame debates in the House of Representatives about whether we give aid to Ukraine at a time when, we've got all these adversaries gathering around us. This is not a safe place for Americans in the world today.
Well, Jeannie, we know that forces are amassing along the Gaza border here and that there will likely be a ground invasion. It's just a question of timing and scale. What do you expect to see from Israel, and to what extent will it color the way Americans are looking at this?
Yeah, I mean, it is a very fraught moment. They are gathered at that border. We do expect a ground invasion. They have to respond, and they have to respond with force. And I'm sure we will hear the president support that. The challenge for Israel and the challenge for the president is that so much of this is going to be covered on social media, and we are going to see live pictures. So the president is going to have to underscore the brutality of what happened, of what Hamas did to the Israelis and to the Palestinians, what they did to their own people over this weekend, and the terror that they wrought, and explain why this tough response is necessary, why we need to support it, not just today and tomorrow and for the next few days, but for weeks and months going forward, because that's how long it is going to take. I think he has also got to address what is a looming public opinion challenge for him in the United States and for Israel, which is that you see an awful lot of dissension already in hours after this on college campuses and in cities across this country. He has got to bring people along to explain why this is in our interest and what we can do as peace-loving democratic people to support a proper way forward on this. So it is an enormous challenge for him, and he is doing so with the United States, one hand behind our back, having no Speaker of the House and our own domestic politics in something of disarray. So an enormous challenge, but the president has got to be up to it. It has been 2 days of silence. As you mentioned yesterday at this time, Joe, they put a lid on the president at 11 yesterday. We haven't heard from him since. He's got to come out strongly here, and he's got to promise to be present every day going forward to lead the world through this crisis.
Update from Turkey, Rick Davis. I've been waiting to hear what kind of language that Erdogan would use, and it's not good. We heard from him at a news conference with the Austrian chancellor a short time ago. This is just off the terminal, Rick. He says, "What is a U.S. aircraft carrier doing in Israel?" This is a direct quote. "It is going to shoot around Gaza and cause a very serious massacre." This is, of course, a NATO member speaking. How much does the U.S. need to worry about President Erdogan?
Look, I think we have to always be on alert that Erdogan is under enormous pressure within his own region. Sure. He is dependent upon Russia for oil and gas supplies. He treads lightly with Russia on security assistance because he is a member of NATO, and we obviously have a shooting war going on in Europe. So he finds himself in a very particular position, and not to mention the fact that he has a lot going on with Russia, vis-a-vis the fighting that's going on in Syria. So they are engaged in the backyard of Israel with Russia, fighting, various groups of terrorists. So he is completely conflicted, and I am confident that Vladimir Putin is using this opportunity to try and divide allies and nations in a way that can create as much disruption for Israel as possible. Mm-hmm. This is a great day for the despots around the world because they see America now having to traffic cop another skirmish in the region that otherwise, a week ago seemed like a peaceful, relatively peaceful location. So I think Erdogan is making good use of his geography and trying to preserve options for himself, but it doesn't do the United States any good whatsoever.
Jeannie, what does Joe Biden need to say about hostages today? There are a lot of worries about Americans who might be held in Gaza as we speak.
He's got to say we are going to do everything we can to support Israel and to bring all of the hostages home safely. One of the things that we haven't talked a lot about, it is a major precept of Judaism that you don't leave anyone behind. So this is not only an issue of national and political commitment, but also of religious commitment for anybody who is Jewish. And so the president has got to say, and we just heard from Mark Esper, there may be Americans held over there as well, other foreign nationals, that we are going to do everything we can to support bringing those hostages all home safely. And, just to follow on what you were talking about Turkey, this is why the tweet that came out of the State Department that they then deleted was so frustrating for so many people. This was that tweet which said Anthony Blinken saying, and obviously not written by him, that they were talking to Turkey about a ceasefire, and then that was deleted. It was the second deleted State Department tweet since this crisis. They've got to be very, very careful about statements like that. Obviously, again, not something Tony Blinken himself, sent out or was justified, and they did delete it. But it is very, very concerning because of the situation in Turkey. Yes, we should be talking to them, but they have to be very careful about the statements that come out. And that tweet was a mammoth mistake by the State Department.
Well, it reminds us how careful President Biden will need to be with his words, albeit stern. I think to your point, Rick, this would be one of those days where the communications office is saying no questions, right? We're going to go out there, we're going to stick to the script, a strong message, come back behind closed doors.
Yeah, you would think that would be the case. It'll be interesting just moments from now to hear from the president directly and see whether or not he undermines that potential request by the communications office to let the speech speak for itself.
That would be your advice?
That would certainly be my advice, especially if the speech has any kind of importance to it vis-a-vis the American people and the Israeli people. I got to believe it will, right? And the presumption is he's going to say something important because he's the president and this is an important time. But like the minute he starts taking questions, because he loves to take questions, I give him credit for that. He likes to talk to the American public through the press. Sure. No telling what's going to come out of his mouth. And this is one where you just want to leave well enough alone and let the speech or the talk speak for itself.
What do you think, Jeannie? No freelancing today, or is this the moment where he digs down and speaks passionately from the heart?
I'm not sure he should freelance. That's never a good idea in times like this. But certainly all the reporters from Bloomberg and elsewhere will be trying to get a question in. And he is very, to Rick's point, tempted to answer them. We know that's his personality. So they're going to give it a try, and we'll see if he goes for it. He should not, however.
Okay, you got the advice from two crack strategists here. I hope the president, of course, is listening. He just got off the phone with Benjamin Netanyahu, and we'll be in the state dining room at some point soon here. We're waiting for the press pool to gather, and we'll keep you posted. We'll bring you the president's remarks live once they are delivered from the White House. He's got a lot of audiences, domestically and abroad today. And, of course, they include the audience here on Sound On. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington with our signature panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, and we want to keep you up to date on things here. For that, we get a check on world and national news with Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. President Biden, as you mentioned, is expected to address the conflict underway in the Middle East in just a few minutes. He and Vice President Kamala Harris have just gotten off the phone with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, which is what has delayed Biden's speech. Bloomberg's White House reporter Jordan Fabian on what Biden is expected to say.
Condemning the violence that we've seen, and also what the U.S. might do to provide assistance for Israel in what looks to be a protracted fight against Hamas in the Gaza Strip.
The death toll in that conflict is now approaching 2,000. The House Intelligence Committee plans to meet this afternoon to discuss intelligence failures ahead of Saturday's Hamas attack on Israel. Republican French Hill of Arkansas sits on the committee and tells us what he wants to discuss.
What's the intelligence say about the partnership that helped Hamas carry out was a surprise attack on Israel? So that's, I think, the first thing and the first and most important thing. Secondly, what is the response of Israel to that attack on their sovereign land, and what can the United States do to stand with our ironclad ally and partner in the region to repel it?
Republican French Hill of Arkansas spoke on Bloomberg surveillance. After ruling out running for president in 2024, former Maryland Governor Larry Hogan now signals he's leaving the door open to pursue the Republican nomination. He says he'll see how things look next spring. Hogan spoke about his plans in an interview on Bloomberg Television.
I'm still trying to figure that out, but I'm not walking away, and I'm not willing to give up.
Former Maryland Governor Larry Hogan is one of the most vocal Republican critics of former President Trump. And Carrie Lake, who ran for governor of Arizona and lost, is now setting her sights on the U.S. Senate. She's expected to announce her campaign at a rally tonight. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons.
Profits. Headlines and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. I'm Charlie Pelletan. We are awaiting remarks from President Biden. We'll have them for you shortly, right here on Sound On. A headline from the Bloomberg Professional Service. General Motors Canada and the Unifor Union have reached a tentative agreement. The pact covers 4,200 employees. Workers went on strike today. They have been told to return to their jobs. The union says it will share more details at the appropriate time. GM shares up now by just about 1.5%. Stocks are higher across the board, with the S&P 500 index advancing 31 points, up 0.7%. The Dow's up 179, up 0.5%. NASDAQ is up 103. That is a gain of about 0.8%. We've got spot gold now lower by $1.50 to $18.59 the ounce, down by about 0.1%. 10-year yield 4.64%, with a 2-year 4.96%, and crude oil is down 0.3%, 86.10 a barrel on WTI. A measure of small business optimism across the U.S. has dropped to a 4-month low in September. And with more, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
The outlook for the U.S. economy and credit conditions took a turn for the worse based on data from the National Federation for Independent Business. Small business owners paid an average interest rate of 9.8% on short-term loans, the highest in a decade. Labor shortages persist, with more than half of firms reporting few or no qualified job applicants. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
And repeating our earlier headline, General Motors Canada and the Unifor Union have reached a tentative agreement. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
This is Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
There have been many questions in our time here without a Speaker of the House about what happens with funding for Israel, never mind Ukraine, with the White House already making that supplemental request. We do have a headline important on the terminal right now. Democrats introduce House bill to restock Israel's Iron Dome. Bipartisan bill to appropriate $2 billion for Israel introduced as we reassemble our panel. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Rick, we've talked a lot about life without a speaker here. It's not making things any easier. And incidentally, if you're following along on your home game, they're going to be behind closed doors at 5 p.m. A few hours from now. Steve Scalise, Jim Jordan making their case to the Republican conference. But we don't expect an actual speaker's vote. Well, I guess it could happen as soon as tomorrow, Rick, but I don't think a lot of folks see an outcome in the immediate term here. To what extent will that hamper our ability to help Israel?
Yeah, I think that we're a bit tied up. I mean, even people like Congressman McCall was asking for resolutions of support to Israel to be done on the floor of the House of Representatives, a relatively benign but important measure to show U.S. support for our ally in the region. And we have no mechanism to get a resolution passed. I mean, that's how dysfunctional the House of Representatives are. I mean, tonight the caucus will meet and hear from, Steve Scalise and Jim Jordan. They will ostensibly start trying to select a caucus candidate. Democrats will unanimously support tonight in their own version Hakeem Jeffries for the job of Speaker. And so they'll be standing on the floor tomorrow morning saying, let's vote. We got a candidate. And so Republicans are like, we'll get right back to you.
Right.
So you're right. We don't know how long this is going to last. But there is more urgency today than there was a week ago when they broke, because the reality is the business of the House is important, and it does need to get going. And in addition to funding our government in just a few short weeks, we need to start showing our support for Israel, and that includes being able to allocate economic and military aid.
Jeannie, when you see a headline like this, Democrats introduce House bill. This is the Republican majority, right, in the House. The Democrats introduce House bill to restock Israel's Iron Dome. Are Democrats running the House right now?
Yeah, they don't have the numbers to, but they're certainly trying to get their statements out there. And the reality is we hope that this, what's happened in Israel, introduces some urgency to the Republicans on all of this. But the fact is that the speaker's vote is going to have very little to do with messaging to the outside world or even the rest of the United States. It's going to be about the rules of the speaker, how you overthrow him, funding the government, all the things it was about before this happened. And it just shows us once again how this kind of dysfunction in our own domestic politics has real world consequences on everybody around the world, and ourselves included, and has to be addressed. But there's little mechanism to do that. So we suspect we will get votes, as nobody seems ready or nearly close to the 217, 218 necessary to become speaker on the Republican side.
There's a debate within the Republican conference, Rick Davis, about whether to pass a rule that requires the votes to be counted before they bring this speaker's battle to the floor. So you get behind closed doors, you pick a Jordan, a Scalise, whomever gets to 217, and not until that moment do we go in front of the American people. Does that need to happen?
That's what's happening. That's the plan to hopefully produce a caucus, not just a majority of the caucus, but literally the entire caucus stands behind a winner. You can assume that there'll be a few members who choose to go the other way, a different way. But the reality is it would be an immense embarrassment to recreate the 15 ballot slog that Kevin McCarthy had to go through to become speaker. And if neither one of these candidates actually can get there, the question then is who within the caucus can try and create a sort of coalition to rule the Republicans, and we haven't gotten anywhere near there, right? We've got to test Scalise and Jordan and see whether or not they can actually move votes from one to the other, and if not, then people are going to be starting to look at other people like Hearn or others to see if there's a third, fourth, or fifth candidate, and ultimately potentially even Kevin McCarthy again. To serve as speaker and unite the caucus.
We spent some time here in the Bloomberg Washington Bureau today with Larry Hogan, the former governor of Maryland, of course, Republican. He was on all the short lists of potential third-party candidate, no labels, what have you. But, of course, he was one of the Republicans to come out early against Donald Trump and sort of buck the conventional wisdom in his party. And he's dismayed at what's going on right now. Here's how he put it earlier today.
It would have been a mistake anyway, and then it's in the middle of an election year where we're trying to show that we can govern, and we're showing that we can't. We're proving what everybody hates about Washington. It's nothing but divisiveness and dysfunction, that they can't get out of their own way. And to make matters worse, we're now in multiple crises around the world with the war in Ukraine and this war in the Middle East, and we're rudderless.
We are rudderless. Jeannie, what are Democrats to do in the midst of all this? Just keep voting for Hakeem Jeffries every round, or are they engaging with the Republican leadership as it stands now, Patrick McHenry, whoever else qualifies, to try to create a relationship, to try to maybe strike a deal to move this forward?
Yeah, at this point, all we know is that they are lockstep behind Hakeem Jeffries, as they have been since this House began. Would that change? I'm not sure, but I will tell you, we do hear from people in the last 48 hours on the Democratic side, and I'm talking just people in passing, constituents, who say Democrats should do something, particularly given what's going on in Israel, to get even a temporary speaker in place. So they may be hearing some of that from their constituents who say enough is enough. And what's fascinating, to Hogan's point, you go down to Matt Gaetz' district while he is being, really, looked down at in Washington, D.C. In his own district, they are cheering on what he did. And that is the problem for people like Larry Hogan and others. They are getting support, the Matt Gaetz of the world and the Marjorie Taylor Greens, in their own districts. And so the idea that anything would be different this time around is probably not in the offing.
Rick, Larry Hogan was asked about Matt Gaetz in a different part of the conversation. He referred to him as a cancer on the party and the institution.
So is it surgery or chemo?
I don't know about that. You'll have to tell me. You're the insider. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano with us for the ride today as we wait to hear from Joe Biden. There's no signs he's coming out anytime soon, but when he does, you'll hear his remarks on Israel from the White House This is Sound On, only on Bloomberg.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. We are awaiting remarks from President Biden. We will have them for you live here on Sound On when the President speaks. General Motors Canada has reached a tentative agreement with its Canadian union, ending a strike that had halted work at its 3 plants in Ontario about 13 hours after it began. GM shares up now by 1.6%. Boeing says it delivered 27 commercial jets in September, marking the 3rd consecutive month that shipments have declined as manufacturing glitches put its annual target in jeopardy. PepsiCo raised its earnings growth forecast and reported results that beat expectations. And with more on the PepsiCo story, here's Bloomberg's Steve Rappaport.
Charlie, consumers were absorbing higher prices on the company's snacks and beverages. Earnings of $2.25 per share for the third quarter were above analyst average estimate of $2.16. The maker of Tostitos chips and Mountain Dew sodas reported net revenue of $23.5 billion, also surpassing the consensus estimate. The stock has dropped more than 10% over the past 3 months, hurt by concerns about slowing sales growth and the potential impact on snacking of a new class of obesity medicines that subdue cravings. Chief Financial Officer Hugh Johnston says so far, appetite-suppressing drugs haven't affected sales of its snacks and sodas, though the company is focused on package size and consumers' portion control concerns as it aims to reach its raised annual forecast. Charlie?
And that's Steve Rappaport reporting PepsiCo shares. They're up right now by 2.2%. Rival Coca-Cola up by 2.6%. Those are our top company stories at this hour. I'm Charlie Pellip. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
We are live from Washington, where we'll add Kaylee Lyons to the conversation coming up in just 5 minutes. Some final thoughts ahead from our panel as well after we check world and national news with Nancy Lyons. For that, we go to the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. Well, we are still waiting to hear from President Biden following a phone call he had with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Biden is expected to reiterate U.S. support for Israel's war with Hamas. Well, the death toll there is now nearly 2,000, but that's expected to rise as attacks continue. Israel's retaliation has largely been in the form of airstrikes within the Gaza Strip. Bloomberg's Galit Altstein is based in Tel Aviv and has the latest.
We're hearing from IDF spokespeople today that the focus now is on aerial attacks over Gaza. They're speaking about unprecedented attacks over the past 36 hours that are taking place by rounds. Every 4 hours, they go to strike different targets.
Bloomberg's Galit Altstein says Israeli military officials are acting on every small bit of intelligence they've received and admit it's tougher to tell if civilians are being injured in their barrage. Republican lawmakers will meet behind closed doors tonight to hear from the two candidates who could replace Kevin McCarthy as Speaker. It's unclear if Steve Scalise or Jim Jordan have the support needed to win the Speaker election, which is set for tomorrow. One of former President Trump's most vocal Republican critics says he's keeping the door open to a presidential run next year. We get more from Bloomberg's Nathan Hager.
Former Maryland Governor Larry Hogan tells Bloomberg he'd consider a run if next year ends up being a Biden-Trump rematch, but he says he doesn't want to play spoiler.
I don't want to run a race to nibble around the edges. If I thought there was a path to success to win the race, and I just said I wouldn't shut the door.
Hogan says his focus is on getting the GOP back on track. He says Nikki Haley could still emerge as a Trump alternative, and he says he's disgusted by the infighting that's left the House without a speaker. In Washington, I'm Nathan Hager, Bloomberg Radio.
Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons. Back to you, Joe.
All right, Nancy, thank you. I want to explore that story for just a moment. Larry Hogan, who joined us today in the Washington Bureau here at Bloomberg, says he's keeping the door open. Now, that could be a no-labels candidacy. He's one of the honorary national co-chairs, something we discussed with him today here at Bloomberg. It could be a third party of a different sort, I suppose. And, of course, we've got Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzena with us to weigh in. Rick, as a Republican, there's a former Republican governor here. I wonder your take on Larry Hogan, why he keeps the door open when it seems there's no path. I'll tell you what, why don't we bring in Jeannie, maybe we can get Rick fixed up there. I don't hear him, but Jeannie, your thought on that as well.
Yeah, I think he keeps the door open because, like so many Americans, he sees that the last thing the American public wants is a rematch of Biden-Trump, and that looks like what we might get. And of course, this is coming on the heels of RFK Jr. saying yesterday he is going to not only give Biden a run for his money, he's stepping out and he's going to take it to the Republicans as well. So Trump was welcoming him as a Democrat, not so much as an independent. So this race is still fluid from that perspective. While Biden and Trump look strong, the reality is that Americans are not excited to do this all over again, Joe, as you well know.
Yeah, indeed. So does Joe Biden have something to worry about in a no-labels run, or have you turned away from it? Rick, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks to be back on the show. Look, I think the no labels thing is a bit of a fantasy. When you look at the history of this, Ross Perot got 19% of the popular vote and wound up with absolutely zero electoral votes. You need electoral votes to be president. They got to prove that they can get those, and I don't think it's possible.
All right, Rick Davis, thank God we got that microphone on, and Jeannie Shanzano, our signature panel here on Sound On, the fastest show in politics. We've got a lot to cover still. We haven't even heard from President Biden yet. He was scheduled to speak an hour ago, and we will bring you his remarks straight ahead. Many thanks to the panel. Rick and Jeannie, Hour 2 of Sound On starts right now.
Okay, thank you. Now, from our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Sound On.
The Biden administration says we're making good on a long-held promise. Ballooning budget deficits in Washington. We're in a bizarro political world here.
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
Most people, including most Republicans in Congress, understand that we need to get aid to Ukraine.
Who's going to take us in a rational way into the future and lead our country?
This has really become kind of the new frontier in American politics, is this battle between red states and blue cities.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
President Biden set to address the nation on the situation in Israel at any moment. Welcome to Hour 2 of Sound On. As we wait to hear from the president, who just got off the phone with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, we'll hear the view from the White House through the words of the president, and we'll talk strategy and next steps in this retaliation against Hamas with retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former commanding general of the U.S. Army in Europe. Later this hour, we'll talk shutdown politics with Representative Carlos Jimenez, the Republican from Florida, hearing from both of the candidates for Speaker today, and will share his view with us. Let's get to Wall Street first. An update on trading now from Charlie Pellet in New York.
Thank you very much, Joe Matthew. We are higher across the board right now. All main groups in the S&P 500 are advancing as the gauge approaches 4,400. The S&P up now by 0.7%, picking up 32 points. The Dow up 195, up by about 0.6%. The Nasdaq Composite Index up 105, now up by 0.8%. Stocks rose. Treasury yields fell after comments from Fed officials bolstered speculation. The WTI down by about 0.3%. Brent crude, the global benchmark at 87.81. Barrel of Brent down now by 0.4%. 10-year yield 4.65%, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.97%. Again, stocks higher across the board. The Dow, the S&P, and Nasdaq all gaining. Well, certainly a major issue in the presidential election will be the health of the U.S. economy and the outlook for a recession. Jim Bianco is the president and founder of Bianco Research.
The idea that, don't worry, we're going to see a slowing of the economy to justify the Fed being done and rate cuts next year has been wrong for 18 months, and I just don't see evidence right now that the tide is turned and that that's going to be the right call.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Walmart is going to be offering online primary care doctors to about 1 million people on its employee health insurance plan in an attempt to improve medical outcomes and lower costs. Walmart shares, they're up 1.2%. Recapping, the S&P up 32 points, up 0.7%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie, thank you. Welcome to Hour 2 of Bloomberg Sound On. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, alongside Kaylee Lines, who joins us for the conversation every day at this time. And Kaylee, we thought we would have heard from President Biden already. This would be our post-speech analysis with you, and he hasn't started yet, and there's a good reason for that. He was actually on the phone with Benjamin Netanyahu, as we understand the vice president was as well, kind of outlining the actions taking place here. And Bloomberg is reporting that he's going to take a pretty hard line in this address.
Yeah, we're expecting him to outline specifically what the U.S. is doing to support Israel after these attacks from Hamas and amid the ongoing violence that we are still very much seeing in the region at the moment. But of course, it becomes a question of what exactly the president is going to promise and whether or not he needs congressional buy-in in order to actually deliver. Because if it's any aid that requires congressional approval, there is a giant question mark, Joe, as to how quickly that approval can actually be granted, considering
Absolutely.
there is no Speaker of the House.
We just finished a conversation with Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino. I don't think either of them see a speaker emerging by the end of the week. Never mind something tomorrow. But that is actually what the Republican conference is hoping.
They're going to try.
They'll try. Whether Jim Jordan, Steve Scalise get to 217 is another thing, but it might take a small miracle for that to happen.
Yeah, you need the majority number in order to actually get the Speaker's gavel. And if you're kind of splitting votes in the different factions of the Republican conference, it's hard to figure out how exactly the math is going to work. And frankly, whether they're going to be ready to bring something to the floor in the next, say, 24 hours and change.
Yeah. Look, my question right now is, is Hakeem Jeffries running the House? You see Democrats introduced a bill to restock Israel's Iron Dome, which is exactly what you're talking about here. You're not going to get anywhere with that without a speaker, though, or the rest of the House. And so a lot of question marks as we wait to hear from the president. We'll bring you those remarks live once again, and a great opportunity to bring in the General, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, retired former commanding general, U.S. Army Europe. It's great to see you, General. Welcome back to Bloomberg. We have very specific questions about what's going to happen next here as this retaliation unfolds. We know that the first order of business, though, is what's been described essentially as a hostage rescue mission. To what extent can the Israelis, working with the U.S., get these hostages out of Gaza before there's a ground invasion?
Well, of course, what Hamas has done, and the reports that came out today of infants that were murdered, just really highlights who it is the Israelis are dealing with and what kind of people Hamas has. Probably a major concern for the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, how do they carry out their mission and also try to get hostages out of there? That's going to be very difficult because Hamas, of course, will be using these hostages exactly for the purpose of making it difficult for the IDF. At some point, the mission is going to have to be not only is it hostage rescue, but also the response to Hamas. They're not going to be able to wait a lot longer before they have to put troops in there, I believe.
Okay, so if you think that moment is coming, it also is a question of how this fighting should be done, General. How do you fight this kind of war? Obviously, we have all seen the images and videos in the past several days of the Iron Dome in action, blocking missiles coming from Gaza. And yet this is also kind of door-to-door warfare in some sense, right? What does Israel need to be utilizing in this moment?
Well, Kaylee, you've touched on a couple of important points here. There are different aspects to this fight. The missiles and rockets that are coming they're coming from somewhere. I mean, Hamas, Hezbollah, they're being resupplied by Iran. And so if you can step back from the door-to-door fighting for just a minute and think strategically, this is connected to Russia. I mean, Russia is who's benefiting from this. To see the U.S. and others distracted, nobody's even mentioned Ukraine in the last 72 hours. And I think that this is Russia and its most important ally, Iran, opening a second front to relieve pressure on Russia, to distract support away from Ukraine. Iran, of course, which is the closest ally to Russia, has been wanting to prevent Israel and Saudi Arabia, Iran's number one rival, from coming closer together. So that's the strategic level of what's going on. And so keeping the pressure on Russia will help reduce, I think, Iran's ability to help Hamas and Hezbollah. Now, to the actual fighting that's going to happen once it begins, interestingly, the Israelis have mobilized or called up 300,000 reservists. I mean, that's everybody. So they are thinking long-term, massive combat power. But I think also they don't want to go rushing in there. I think they'll take their time doing what they can to get as many hostages out of there as possible. They're going to be conscious that the world is watching to see how much damage is done to civilian infrastructure inside the Gaza Strip. But they are not going to mess around. They're going to do what they have to, I think, to punish Hamas so much that it's a very long time before they try this again.
We have eyes on the state dining room and the podium that has been set up for President Biden. We will be hearing from the president. We'll bring you his remarks live when he is set to speak. We're about an hour and 10 minutes late for his appointment right now. General, we spoke earlier in the broadcast with the former Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, who talked to us about the ability for the U.S. to transfer American weapons that are being actually housed in Israel to Israel for their use. Is that something that should be happening now? Do we kind of unlock the doors and give them everything we've got, or do we need to hold some of these munitions for our own use?
Well, I think the president has stated that rock solid support of the United States for Israel, has have other countries. So I imagine if the Israelis ask for specific things to include weapons that might be stored inside Israel, that they will probably be handed over unless there is some overarching reason that we would not want to do that. But I imagine this kind of thing will go quickly once the decision is made. But one of the key factors is, and if I was the Israeli ground commander, I would want to know, what is my mission? What is the expectation? They're not just going into Gaza to kill a bunch of people. Is it going to be a punishment mission, a punitive mission, or is it going to be something, are they going to have to occupy Gaza for the long term? That calls for a different sort of approach to doing this, and that will also require a lot of people, and there will be a lot of casualties. So what is the mission? And then if I know what the mission is, then that tells me what kind of munitions and other weapon systems and support I'm going to need.
Well, to your point on the mission, does the mission change if other players get drawn into this in a more material way? Generally, you were just speaking about the notion of Iran supporting this effort, potentially Russia by extension. What if Iran were to get drawn into this in a more material way? Should Israel hypothetically decide to retaliate for supporting Hamas, for example, or the role of Hezbollah in this? How are you viewing the Iran wild card right now?
So this is an important consideration for the Israeli staff, the commander in staff. They will not all go rushing into Gaza because they have to be concerned about the West Bank. They have to be worried about Hezbollah in the north of Israel. So I think that they will be very alert to all the different possibilities. They'll maintain forces and capabilities that could flex to where other requirements might arise. And I think it would be, I think Iran actually does not want to get drawn into this. I think they're quite happy to have Hamas and Hezbollah do all the fighting. Iran being able to stay out of that to avoid strikes, not only from Israel, but from anywhere else, if that's being considered. So the Iranians will have, I mean, they know what kind of a punch the Israelis have. And so I think that they are not ready yet to see it expand in that way.
Well, so what are we in for here when this retaliation really kicks into gear? Obviously, Israeli troops are amassing on the Gaza border. General, will Israel have any regard for Palestinian civilians who are living in Gaza?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the President Netanyahu has been telling Palestinians they need to leave. They need to move away from places where Israeli forces are likely to strike. And I think the Israelis know that the whole world is watching to see, will the Israelis be indiscriminate? Will they just launch weapons into the very densely populated area? Or will there be consideration given? I think there will. Hamas knows this, of course. They will use even their own, the Gazans as shields. They will use mosques to store ammunition and to operate. So this will be tough. At the end of the day, it comes down to what is the mission? What is the desired end state that Israel has? Is this punitive, or are they thinking they may have to occupy a portion of Gaza to try and eradicate it as a base for attacks against Israel?
General, there's been a lot of comparison here to Hamas and ISIS, and the idea that maybe Hamas needs to be targeted in the same way that ISIS was. How fair is that comparison, and where are there difficulties in making that kind of comparison when viewing the terrorist organization itself as it's been designated?
Well, that's an interesting comparison. I think the similarity, of course, are that these are terrorist organizations that absolutely do not care about whether or not they kill innocent people if it helps them accomplish their goal. Hamas does not care about Palestinian people. This is all about trying to kill as many Israelis as they possibly can. So when you talk about fighting against ISIS or fighting against Hamas, and the target is similar, but the context, the environment is different. I mean, ISIS, of course, was spread over much of the Middle East and Africa, whereas Hamas is a very specific organization in a specific place, which, by the way, has a rival organization as well, another Palestinian organization that is not as militant as is Hamas. So the Israelis will have to go after that in a way that's different from the way we have gone after ISIS.
General, it's great to have you. We appreciate your insights today. Obviously, something that we're going to continue talking about. We'd love to include you in our conversations going forward. General Ben Hodges, former commanding general, U.S. Army Europe, with us here live on Bloomberg. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, along with Kaylee Lyons, as we bring you the show here on the radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube, where you can join us right now. Search Bloomberg Global News. Our cameras are up, and our guests are smiling, although there's not a lot to smile about today, Kaylee, with the news that's coming from overseas and here in Washington. We have to keep getting back to the fact that this is actually a very important day in the Capitol as well, as the Republican conference meets behind closed doors to try to coalesce around a candidate for speaker. And as we began this hour, there's no clear direction in where that is going. All these stories overlap when it comes to the matter of funding.
Absolutely. As we await remarks from President Biden, who is going to express U.S. support for Israel, Congress may have a very large role to play there. And as you say, though, Joe, Congress, while paying attention to this conflict, obviously, we've heard a number of members outspoken about it in recent days, also has the distraction of trying to elect new leadership, trying to get someone the speaker's gavel. And they're going to try further this evening, theoretically. 5 p.m. is when the Republican conference will meet to try to coalesce around one candidate. But right now it is so very fractured, it's very hard to see how you get to a majority vote.
Yep, absolutely right. They're going to gather in the Ways and Means Committee room at 5 p.m., just in time for balance of power. I figure they're all going to gather around the television. The candidates forum at one time, though, was supposed to be on television. Just when you think about the stuff that has come and gone over the last week, for about 12 hours, that was a Fox broadcast. Then it wasn't. Is he still doing the thing behind closed doors? I don't even know where that stands right now, because they've got to make their case here, and they're meeting as well with the delegations. You were outside that Texas delegation meeting a couple of days ago. Today, the Florida delegation, that's 20 members, as they pick their way through the conference, trying to find enough people to make this work. And so far, neither can make that claim.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Florida delegation.
Yeah.
There's
Somebody
one Republican congressman from Florida,
wonder.
Carlos Jimenez, said he'd only vote for Kevin McCarthy.
The guy, another representative from Florida, got fired.
Right.
So that's going to be an interesting meeting. Carlos Jimenez, he should come on the broadcast today.
Yeah, he should.
He's going to call in later?
I think he's planning on it.
That's what Kaylee tells us. That'll be about 10 minutes from now. I'm Joe Matthew with Kaylee Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg, and we are awaiting remarks from President Biden. We will have them for you live right here on Sound On when the president steps to the podium. General Motors has reached a contract with its Canadian union, ending a strike that began about 13 hours earlier at 3 plants in Ontario. GM shares are up 1.7%. GM workers will be back on the job today. Stocks are higher. Treasury yields fell after comments from Federal Reserve officials bolstered speculation the central bank is heading toward another pause in rate hikes. The S&P is up 27 points now, a gain of 0.6%. The Dow up 156, up by about 0.5%, while the NASDAQ Composite Index is up 94. That is a gain of 0.7%. 10-year yield 4.65%, with a 2-year 4.97%. Spot gold 18.59 the ounce, down 0.1%. West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.4%, 86.07 a barrel. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Keely Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
To be behind the scenes today at the White House would certainly tell us a lot, including why the president is almost an hour and a half late for a scheduled address to the nation on the situation in Israel. We'll bring you his remarks when he does begin speaking. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Keely Lines. We know he was on the phone with Benjamin Netanyahu earlier, he and the vice president. That may have slowed things down a little bit. This is clearly a very busy time as